Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is a story about If Deku was the Doctor's creation part 1. If you guys enjoy this what if and want to see part 2, comment down below and let me know before I start. Please do support for more awesome content and leave a like, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel and also share this video with your friends and check out the description in my playlist. The author of the story HalfQuetzalcoatlHunter from fanfiction. So let's start the video. The birth of a hero 1. The mutation. Dear Mr. Midoriya, I was highly impressed with your attempt to enroll in the hero course here at UA. Your score on our written examination has been ranked as one of the highest in the school's history, and you have been marked for immediate enrollment in our school's general studies and support courses. Concerning your attempts at the practical examination, however, while you did score a modest amount of combat points, I regret to inform you that you have failed to gain enough to qualify for UA's hero course. Enclosed you will find a letter awaiting your signature on whether or not you wish to enroll in either our general studies or support course. Hoping to hear from you soon. Principal Nizu. Izuku had read the letter dozens of times by now, and had the general studies and support course letters in front of him waiting to be signed. However, no matter how much he wanted to enroll in UA, he couldn't make himself sign the forms. He had wanted to prove himself worthy of being a hero so badly that he had spent the last year preparing his body for the test. He was much stronger now, and knew how to defend himself after taking a martial arts class, but even that hadn't helped him. I guess All Might was right. The boy sighed as he took the rejection letter between his hands and ripped it right down the middle before tearing it into smaller pieces and letting it drop into the wastebasket beside his desk. Grabbing a few of his inventions from his desk and stuffing them in his pocket, Izuku got up from his chair and walked out of his room where his mother was waiting worriedly. The woman took one look at her son's face and reached out to hug him. "Oh, sweetheart." She brought him into her arms and started crying. "I'm so sorry." She wept while Izuku patted her back absently. "It's okay," the boy said mechanically. "They said I can still get into the support course and general studies." His mother's mood changed almost immediately when she heard that. "Oh, then isn't that better than being outright turned away?" She smiled up at him in an attempt to cheer him up. "And you would still be able to help heroes with your inventions. Like those little gadgets you like to tinker with all the time." The boy sighed before moving away from his mother. "Yeah," Izuku said before moving away and heading toward the door. He grabbed a light green jacket just as his mother called out to him. "Izuku, sweetie, I know this isn't what you wanted, but realistically, this is much better for you," she said, not knowing that she was breaking his heart into even smaller pieces. "Hero work is dangerous even for those that have powerful quirks, but for you." After 10 years of hearing the same thing, something inside the boy snapped, and it all came rushing out as he lost his temper. "You think I don't know that?" Izuku snapped, his mother's eyes widening in shock. "Believe me, I do." He ground out while the woman just stood in a stupor. "I've had to live with my dream being shattered at every turn by you, my teachers, and people I thought were my friends." "Izuku," she whimpered in an attempt to calm him. But he was far from through with his rant. "And don't think I don't know why Dad never comes home, or even calls us anymore," the boy growled. "He's ashamed of me, and can't stand the sight of his quirkless son." He backed toward the door. Kaken was right, a swan dive off the balcony would be. "Izuku Midoriya," his mother yelled, horrified by his words as he just turned away and walked out of the apartment with the door slamming right behind him. Her tears were spilling over as she sank to the floor and wept. Then her son's words started ringing in her ears. Kaken was right. Kaken was right. "Katsuki?" She rose up and reached for the phone and dialed the Bakugo residence. "Mitsuki? It's Inko. We need to have a talk now." "Spider-Man." Meanwhile, Izuku had made it down the stairs and onto the street, and was walking slowly down the sidewalk, his eyes cast down while he had pulled a hood up over his head. He didn't want anyone from his school in the neighborhood recognizing him. It was no secret that he had tried for UA and suffered for it. Not just mental but physical abuse by many of his classmates. And at the front of the abusers was his former childhood friend, Katsuki Bakugo, whom he often referred to as Kaken. The boy had been blessed with a powerful quirk and had been praised by everyone, from their teachers to the parents of other students, saying that he was sure to be a wonderful hero. Of course, no one had dared to curb the lousy attitude that had come with all of that praise. He had grown prideful and bullheaded. He viewed anyone around him as beneath him since no one had a stronger quirk than he did, And since Izuku didn't have a quirk at all, that meant that Katsuki turned from being his best friend to his worst possible enemy. With the world's population being a quirk-dominated percentage with 80% of the people having a quirk and 20% not having a quirk, those that were diagnosed as quirkless were now seen as the freaks of society, which meant that the term racism had been thrown out the window and had been replaced by geneticism. When it came down to it, even if a person's parents had quirks, that didn't guarantee that person would get one of their quirks, a mix of the two, or at all. It all relied on genetics. And that meant that the fault really didn't lay with Izuku. His father, Hisashi, as it turned out, had a long history of quirklessness in his family. His quirk wasn't even particularly strong either. While he did love his father, he felt that the man was hoping that, when Izuku was born, his child would have a mixture of his and his mother's quirks. Pyrokinesis was rare, and even a weak version of it would be looked upon as remarkable. Flame quirks weren't rare, but they were never useless. But that had all come to a screeching halt when Izuku had been taken in for his quirk analysis and deemed quirkless, all because of an extra joint in his little toe. After that, things had gone from bad to worse. With his powerful explosion quirk, Katsuki had become the picture of a schoolyard bully on steroids in every sense of the word. And Izuku had taken it upon himself to stand up to him, which resulted in all his bullying had shifted to the quirkless boy that didn't know his place. He could still feel the heat from each explosion produced from Katsuki's palms, which were punctuated by cruel words raining down on him such as insect, stepping stone, and possibly the worst of all, Deku. Deku was another way to read the kanji of Izuku's name, changing it to a word that meant worthless. And having suffered the Ashen Blonde's wrath for 10 years, Izuku how knowingly developed a low opinion of himself. Even after he had gotten into Aldera Middle School, things had gotten even worse than before. The teachers of the school didn't care for the fact that one of their students was quirkless, only that another of their students had an impressively powerful quirk and that he was aiming for UA Academy. When it was found out that Izuku was also working his way toward the same school, Katsuki had hit the roof. There wasn't a day that went by that Izuku didn't come home with new wounds, bruises, scrapes, and scorch marks. If you're so desperate for a quirk, why not take a swan dive off the roof and wish for one in your next life? Katsuki had said not so long ago. Right then and there, Izuku realized that there was nothing of his old friend Kaken left in Katsuki Bakugo. He's more of a villain than a hero now, Izuku said to himself as he walked along the street, a rumble of thunder rolling overhead. He looked up and saw storm clouds slowly moving over the city. Just my luck. He sighed as the first drop of rain hit his face. The sound of shoes scuffing the pavement reached his ears, followed by the sound of heavy breathing. Hey, you kid. Izuku turned around and saw a man running toward him. He skidded to a stop right next to him, completely out of breath. Kid, you seen a little girl? He panted from behind a surgical mask while he held up a picture. Looks like this? Izuku looked at the picture, seeing a skinny, pale, white-haired little girl with a tiny horn on the right side of her head. Izuku then looked at the man, along with the surgical mask over his face, and was wearing dark glasses as well as a thick overcoat and gloves. At his side, Izuku was certain he could see the shape of a gun holster tucked underneath the coat. He could also make out the smell of cigarette smoke and a faint hint of some kind of alcohol coming from the man. Izuku simply gave a shrug. Sorry, he said. You're the first person I've run into. He was glad that he didn't have to lie. He was horrible at it. And this person seemed like someone that he'd want nothing to do with. The man growled and shoved the picture back into his pocket. Damn it. He then took off. Boss is gonna kill me. He muttered under his breath as he ran, and the rain began to fall, not bothered about letting Izuku hear him. Izuku then watched him as he rounded the corner of the street and checked his pockets, making sure he had a particular one of his inventions with him. As it happened, he did, so he brought it out and attached it to the inside of his right wrist and palm. It was meant to be a capture weapon he had designated the web shooter. As its name suggested, it shot strong, sticky ropes of a web-like substance that stuck to most anything and were nearly impossible to get off without spreading it, but it was also as strong as steel cables. After his encounter with the supposed gunman, he thought that it would be useful if he happened to run into any more trouble. And he was certainly in no mood to deal with thugs with guns. He covered the device with his sleeve and continued his walk, right before a tiny body came tumbling out of the alley and crashed into his legs. Spider-Man. Back at the Midoriya household, The normally timid 𝗵𝗃 Midoriya was showing her fangs for once. I've put up with that boy of yours for years, Mitsuki, and only because my baby wanted to see the good in him. She half-shouted, half-sobbed into the phone, but after hearing that he practically tried to bait my Izuku into suicide is beyond any amount of reasoning or patience I can muster. Won the other end of the phone, and equally furious Mitsuki Bakugo agreed with her. Don't you worry, 𝗵𝗃, she said as she glared at her son where he was sitting on the couch with a set of headphones on. I'm going to make sure that my little brat knows exactly what he's done this time. Let him know that I'm extremely close to pressing charges against him, Mitsuki, 𝗵𝗃 put in. I know we've been friends for years, but this is too much for me to put up with. If I see even a hint of a scorch mark on Izuku from this point on, Katsuki will face the consequences. While looking at her son, she could tell that the boy obviously hadn't heard a single thing she had said. You better believe he will. Mitsuki said, I'm going to talk to him right now. You just take care of Izuku, alright? Of course. The woman hung up the phone, then marched over to where her son was sitting before yanking the headphones off of him. Katsuki Bakugo, she roared. Startled, the boy rounded on his mother angrily. What the hell, you old hag? Katsuki roared right back at her, only to get a harsh slap right to his face. Masaru, his father, having overheard everything, chose to hide behind his newspaper for once. Meanwhile, his wife was looking down at their son's stunned face. Don't you dare take that tone with me, you brat. She snapped at her dazed son. Did you really try baiting Izuku into jumping off the school roof? It dawned on Katsuki with a snarl. Why that worthless? Before he could go any further, his mother backhanded him on his opposite cheek. Don't you dare try to put all of this on him, you little bastard. Mitsuki glared down at him, angry tears coming to her eyes. Do you know how much I want to call you right now and have them kick you off their roster? You wouldn't dare. She reached out and grasped him by his shirt. Don't you go telling me what I will or won't do either. She roared right into his face. I should have known some bullshit like this would happen after you got such a big head because of that quirk of yours. But I never knew that you were such an asshole that you'd try to openly bait someone to commit suicide. Katsuki tried to speak, his voice beginning to fail him. But his mother was having none of it. No, not another word. She snapped before jabbing her finger into his chest. I'm going to be calling the teachers at UA to let them know exactly what you've done, and so help me if they kick you out, then I say good for them. She shouted, leaning over him. To think that I used to be proud of you, she sighed, her voice finally dropping in volume. Now I can barely stand to look at you. She said as the boy looked away from her. You know, you and Izuku always loved seeing All Might in action, and that made you both do your best to become just like him. She shook her head. But you're acting like a villain. It wasn't a slap to the face, but it might as well have been. But his mother wasn't done as she grabbed the boy by the hair. And get this straight, young man, if you go near Izuku to do anything more than to apologize, both his mother and I are prepared to have charges brought up against you, understand? She released him. If you see Izuku, the first thing out of your mouth had better be I'm sorry, and you'd better mean it, Buster. Not a single singed hair, not a single piece of scorched clothing should be seen on that boy ever again. I make myself clear. He looked away from her, his mouth drawn into a thin line. Mitsuki reached out and grasped him by the chin, forcing him to look at her. Katsuki. He finally gave a small nod. Yes, Mom. Mitsuki stood back with a nod. Good, she said and pointed toward the door. Now get out of here for a while. I need to cool down and it'll be easier if you're not here. He nodded and started for the door. And take an umbrella. It's supposed to rain. He wordlessly snatched up an umbrella from beside the door and walked out. The woman groaned and went over to the couch with her husband, slumping into the seat. How? Mitsuki sighed, palming her face. How did I not see this sooner? You mean how did we not see it sooner? Masaru asked as he folded up his paper. Don't forget, parenting is usually a two-person job and I haven't been keeping up my side of the work. Mitsuki looked at him with a half-smile. True. But you always told me that we needed to curb that attitude of his, she said, and I never listened. Look where that's gotten him now. What if they really do kick him out for this? Masaru shook his head. We do what any parents would do, he said. We beg and we plead, and then we promise to give him every available counseling session that they could make available. He sighed. Our son isn't too far gone that he can't be brought back, Mitsuki. He just needs to be brought down a few pegs. Try a few dozen or so pegs. Mitsuki leaned into her husband's shoulder. How do we do this? He kissed beside her head just above her ear. One step at a time, he told her with a squeeze of her shoulders. 𝗧𝗵𝗲. By the time Katsuki got to the streets below his parents' apartment, the rain was coming down hard and fast. I can't believe this, he thought to himself angrily. It's not my fault that worthless Deku keeps chasing after a dream that's never gonna happen. That was part of the reason he hated him so much. He didn't have a quirk at all, and yet the scrawny teen had continued to act like a hero for as long as he had known him. But no matter what he did to try and distance himself from him, Izuku had always treated him like a friend. What the hell's wrong with me? He growled and kicked at the soaked ground, sending up a small splash. He's just a quirkless loser. Why should it matter to me what he does? Hey! Shouted a girl's voice as she was inadvertently splashed by his kick. Dude, what the crap? Katsuki only grunted as he passed by, intent on ignoring her, but he felt something jab right into his head, and the next thing he knew, his head was filled with insanely loud pounding. Hey jackass, when you do something like that, you usually apologize. Katsuki swatted at the back of his head and rounded on her. What the hell's your problem, bitch? The girl glared at him, unafraid, with her hands on her hips. What's my problem? The girl glared at him while aiming what looked like earphone jacks at him. My problem is the fact that some dickhead wasn't watching what the hell he was doing and just kicked a gallon of muddy water all over me. She snapped at him. That's my problem, asshole. Katsuki's free hands started setting off little firecracker-like explosions. Who are you calling an asshole? She looked down at the boy's smoldering hands, then leveled a glare at him. Go ahead, Demis, use your quirk, she said. My family's friends with a lot of lawyers, and I bet they'd have a field day with someone like. A loud cracking sound echoed through the streets, but it wasn't thunder. The girl jumped upon hearing it, looking stunned, as did Katsuki for that matter. Was that a gunshot? Before Katsuki could say anything, 2 more shots rang out, followed by a little girl's scream. Shit! Abandoning his umbrella, the ashen-haired teen ran down the streets, cursing richly as the stinging rain soaked his palms and washed away any of the nitrous sweat that had built up. Hey! Shouted the girl, her feet splashing as she began to run after him. The boy looked back over his shoulder briefly. Just stay out of this. Katsuki roared. You'll only get in my way. The girl yelled something at him, but he was already tuning everything else out. I'll prove her wrong. I'm not a villain. I'll show her. His mind was racing through all the ways that this could work out for him and make him look better in his mother's eyes after she had said all of those things to him. Another shot rang out as a figure stumbled out from an alley carrying a wrapped bundle in their arms. What the hell? The blonde slid to a halt, nearly colliding with the figure before he recognized a sopping wet mop of greenish-black hair. Deku. Izuku looked up at Katsuki's voice, his face paler than normal. Kaken. The look on his face couldn't have been more relieved. The use of the nickname caused a vein to pulse on the blonde's head. Don't call me that, idiot. He snapped as the teen stumbled toward him, panting heavily. And what's all that shooting about? He demanded of the boy. Who's dumb enough to start shit like that in my neighborhood? Wait up. The girl had caught up with him and was holding his umbrella. She glared at him through her dripping wet bangs. Jerk. You could have waited for me. She snapped at him, her clothes sopping wet from the drenching he'd given her, and now from the rain as well. What if you needed help? Do you even have a phone? Katsuki rounded on her, and I told you to stay out of this. The girl, Izuku noticed, along with her quirk, had short, dark hair and a fair complexion. And she was looking right at him with wide eyes. Hey, are you bleeding? She yelled before shoving the umbrella at Bakugo and rushed forward as she saw the red stains on his t-shirt. It was then that Katsuki noticed that one of Izuku's hands was clamped onto his left side, which was red with blood leaking through his fingers. Holy shit, you've been shot. He's what dash? The explosion teen shouted. Izuku brushed her hands away with a shaky grin. Please don't worry about me, he said before he pushed his bundled-up jacket toward Katsuki. It's her we need to worry about. Katsuki frowned as he lifted a portion of the jacket and saw a pair of terrified little red eyes looking right back at him. To say that the explosive teen was shocked was an understatement. Okay, Deku, what the actual hell? He looked at the injured teen. What's with this kid, and who the fuck shot you? Izuku shook his head with a look as though the action caused him pain. No time to explain, he ground out. The guy that's chasing us won't be too far behind me, but he's only after me, he said and thrust the girl into his arms. You take her and get her to the police station. I'll lead the guy away. Then the three of them heard a small, terrified voice stutter out. And no. Both Katsuki and the girl looked down at the child he was now holding as she reached out a tiny bandaged hand to latch onto Izuku's soaked shirt. Please, don't go. He'll kill you, she pleaded with him, her eyes wide and watery. He always kills the people that are nice to me. I don't want you to die. Her tiny voice was laced with fear and desperation. Izuku just smiled as he reached up and patted her on the head. Don't you worry, he said, keeping his tone calm for the little girl. I'm not going to die. If there's one thing I'm actually good at, it's finding a way to get through anything. He winked at her and then looked back at Katsuki. You want to be a hero so much, well, here's your chance. His voice turned cold and serious. Get her out of here. Katsuki was about to argue, but the green-haired teen turned him around by his shoulders and gave him a shove. I said get out of here. He repeated more forcefully before looking to the girl. You had better go too. And you should get to a hospital. The girl snapped as she handed Katsuki his umbrella. Look, I don't know what's going on. She looked down at his side where the blood was freely flowing between his fingers. But I'm not going to leave someone behind when they're hurt this bad. Katsuki looked between the two of them and growled. There's a clinic not far from here. She looked at him with raised eyebrows. It's small, but they should be able to patch him up enough to get him to a hospital. He pointed down the street toward the west. I'll take the kid to the police and see if I can send some help. He then glared at the wounded boy. You just try not to die on me, you damn nerd, or I'll kill you. Izuku gave a weak, crooked smile. Got it, he said with a slow nod before he started off in the direction of the clinic both of them knew. He stumbled once, but was caught by the girl around his ribs before he could hit the ground, though the action made him wince. Sorry, she said, trying to find a decent hold on him that wouldn't cause him pain. Just let me help you, okay? Izuku shook his head. You'd be safer if you went with them, he gestured to Katsuki. Besides, I don't want you getting mixed up in my mess. A vein pulsed on Katsuki's head. Well, thanks a lot for getting me involved, you loser. The other boy growled before moving off, casting a glare at the girl over his shoulder. Keep the idiot alive, all right? The girl let out a small laugh before she turned them down the street. All right, come on, she said to the injured boy while the rain began to fall harder. We need to go. The rain should wash away the blood trail. Izuku didn't argue as he was led along. Katsuki ran down the street with the little girl tucked against his chest, glancing back over his shoulder at the two of them. Damn it, Deku. Don't you dare die on me. Not until I've apologized. 𝗧𝗵𝗲. A few streets over, the man that had been chasing Izuku and the girl frowned as he took out his cell phone. Boss, I got bad news, the thug said as he took shelter under an awning. The kid got snatched up. Some teenage ran off with her. Where did they go? Said the man on the other end. What prefecture? The thug groaned. I don't know how she made it this far, but she managed to get all the way to Mustafar City, he said. You know that place near Shizuoka? A snarl was heard over the receiver. That far? What the hell were the others thinking? I don't know, boss. I only got the notice about half an hour before I ran into that little rat that snatched her. The thug frowned. Listen, boss, I hate to sound like a jackass, but I think I'm gonna need some help. You got any contacts with the police in this area? Unfortunately not, the man growled. It's fine for now. Just let it go. We have enough of her cells to work with for now. In the meantime, keep your eyes open for the brat, and keep me updated. The moment you see even a strand of that girl's hair, you call me right away, understand? The thug nodded. If I'm lucky, that might not be too much longer, he chuckled. I nailed the brat that took her with 9mm hollow point. He chuckled. He should be bleeding out anytime. Good, the man said. At least you made the little bastard pay. 𝗧𝗵𝗲. Seeing Izuku with his shirt off would have normally made the nudity-hating 𝐒𝐭𝐲 blush neon red, but while he was very fit for someone his age, maybe due to a strength-enhancing quirk, his body was covered in scars. More scars than she thought possible for anyone outside of pro-hero work, or any other dangerous jobs or military service. You're in bad shape, young man, Dr. Tsubasa said as he examined the gunshot wound in the boy's side. If this bullet had gone even 1/4 of an inch in either direction, you'd be short a lung. Or possibly paralyzed. The girl frowned at the doctor as the boy winced while he stitched the wound up. "You seriously need to work on your bedside manner, Doc," she huffed. "The guy just risked his life for a little girl, and you're telling him he was damned lucky to make it this far?" 𝗬𝗏 looked at the girl through his strange-looking goggles. "That's not what I meant at all, my dear," he said, as he dabbed the area with alcohol, making the boy hiss. "I'm actually quite impressed that a boy his age could take such damage without a type of healing quirk." 𝐭𝐞𝐲 smiled at the boy as his face twisted in a sort of half-smile at the praise. "Well, whatever his quirk is, it must be doing something to help him if he's not bawling his eyes out right now." The boy looked ready to cry. "WL." The doctor beat him to the punch. "Oh, Izuku doesn't have a quirk at all, young lady," the doctor said, which caused the boy to flinch. "Which is why I'm so impressed." The girl looked at Izuku with a new light in her eyes. But, for Izuku, it wasn't the look of loathing or disgust he had come to expect because of his harsh treatment. It was a look of pure amazement. You don't have a quirk?" Her voice rose in pitch. "But I saw you at the UA entrance examens." Izuku chuckled weakly. "Well, I did okay on the written part, but I couldn't break very many of the robots," he said as he held up his scarred hands. "Still, though, that was a pretty ballsy thing to do," she said, impressed. "Humph." The doctor snorted as he went to one of the cabinets. "Ballsy isn't the word I would use. Just to let you know," he said, pausing as he pulled out a vial of green liquid. He looked over at the boy for a moment before nodding. "A little cocktail of antibiotics and small amount of steroids, and you should be fine in a few weeks if those stitches hold up," he said as he retrieved a syringe. The girl hissed in mock pain as she saw the needle. "Oh boy." "What?" Izuku asked. It's nothing. I was just thinking that I forgot to tell you my name," she stammered as the man snuck up behind him. "I'm, Kyokujiro, and I gotta say you're pretty brave out there when—" 𝗬𝗏 jabbed him. "Yow." Izuku propelled himself off the table a good 3 feet. "Oh." 𝐭𝐞𝐲 winced as Izuku glared weakly at the doctor as he chuckled. The boy groaned. "A little warning would have been nice. I did say that you would be getting a mix of antibiotics and a light steroid, but I didn't say how you'd get it," the doctor chuckled. "Now, I must warn you that you will feel a bit feverish as a mild side effect, but that will pass quickly," he said as the boy sat up, allowing him to begin wrapping bandages around his waist. "I've also had the nurse call your mother. She should be here in a few minutes, so if the young lady wouldn't mind keeping your company for a little while longer, I'll have you moved to a recovery room so you can rest, and get you hooked up to 𝗵𝗃 to replenish the lost blood. You must be feeling quite dizzy by now." Izuku nodded as he finished with the bandages. "Okay, thank you, Miss Jiro," he said as the girl moved to support his weight. 𝗂𝐭𝐲 blushed. Just call me 𝗂𝐿𝐴, she said as the boy looked at her in surprise. "You've been bleeding on me for a little while, so I'd say that at least puts us on a first-name basis." 𝗬𝗏. A few minutes after the 2 teenagers left the examination room, 𝗬𝗏 closed and locked the door and pulled out his phone. "Master, I've got a little bit of news for you." "Do you now?" said a smooth voice. "What do you have to report?" 𝗬𝗏 chuckled. "Do you recall my little experiment with the devil's breath and its effects on animals?" There was a chuckle from the other end of the phone. "Indeed I do," said the master. "As I recall, you were testing it on different species of arachnids. Primarily spiders, wasn't it?" "Indeed, and I've just tested the mutated venom on a young man that just came back into my old clinic here in Mustafar," he said whilst twirling his mustache. "Poor boy was shot, it seems, with a hollow point, no less. What I didn't tell him was that bullet tore up some of his vital organs, and he would have been dead by the morning since I didn't have the right equipment here to treat such a wound. However, if the venom acts as it should, then the boy should be able to regenerate within a few hours of the injection." The master chuckled. "Still trying to make up for not finding the cell regeneration quirk in time, are we? Can you blame me, master? You're technically blind after all. 𝗬𝗏 sighed. And it was I that failed to heal you in time. What other side effects do you expect?" asked the master. 𝗬𝗏 hummed and thought for a moment. "If it's a negative reaction, then he won't last the night. The venom I used was from a mutated black widow I procured from overseas, after all. However, if the effects are positive, as I've said, he'll heal and be right as rain by morning," he said, "though I don't know if there will be any other effects. When testing the venom on rats, they seem to take on arachnid-like traits. One even grew a few extra limbs. This boy is quirkless, however, and the first human subject I've ever tested it on, so I'm quite excited to see what comes of it. As am I, my old friend, as am I, said the master. Do keep me informed, won't you? But of course, Tsubasa said. By the way, have you made any progress with your little spy? The master chuckled. Why, yes, as a matter of fact, I have, he said with amusement. The boy was quite willing to comply after I had a little conversation with his parents. 𝗧𝗵𝗲. So, Kyoka said as she sat by Izuku's hospital bed while she twirled one of her jacks around her finger, you tried to get into the hero course without a quirk? Izuku, who was now reclining on his bed with a bag of blood hooked up to his arm, nodded sheepishly. I know it was dumb, but I had to try, he said. I've wanted to be a hero all of my life. I even took up a martial arts class and physical training to get my body in shape in time for the test. It shows. The girl noted silently as she had seen a fair amount of his chiseled chest and abs while he was being worked on, and she had to admit that, scars or no scars, the boy was nice to look at. He'd be cute if he wasn't so damned pale. She frowned as a light sheen of sweat started to show on his forehead. You're sweating a little. She took a cloth from the bedside table and dabbed at his face. Must be the fever the doctor warned us about. Izuku gave a small awkward smile. I do feel a little warm, the boy admitted, his cheeks flushed. While Kyoko was mopping up the sweat from his face, she placed her hand against his forehead, making him yelp a little at the contact. Kyoka? He stammered as she drew back her hand, waving it slightly. Geez, you're on fire, she said with a look of worry across her face. Maybe I should go get a nurse or something? Izuku frowned. Really, I feel fine, he lied, while in truth he felt like his insides were churning, and not just because of the bullet hole in his side. Even the simple touch of her cool hand had sent a near electrical shockwave over his skin, but he thought that the cause might have had something to do with the fact that an exceedingly pretty girl was caring for him. Kyoka shook her head. You don't look it, the girl said stubbornly before she got to her feet. Look, you just lay back and rest, and I'll see if a nurse can come in and check up on you, all right? She said as she moved toward the door. I wanted to call my folks to let them know where I am, anyway. Izuku nodded, feeling a little more than off and not trusting his voice, as the girl exited the room and curled in on himself as he clutched at his stomach. 𝐒𝐻𝐢𝐳. His stomach heaved, emptying its contents as he leaned over the side of the bed, while the heat began to spread from his forehead throughout his body, his heart pounding rapidly. What's happening to me? He groaned again in pain and rolled over, his body falling from the bed. The machinery that he was hooked up to suddenly started beeping loudly as the IVs and monitors came undone from his body. His groans then turned into pained wails, just as Kyoka came bursting back into the room with a nurse right behind her. Birth of a Hero 2, the fever. Toshinori Yagi had never felt like such a hypocrite in his entire life since becoming a hero. The hypocritical part of his career being that while he watched the entire portion of the UA entrance exam, he had seen a young man that he had once met on the street, begging for him to say that he could be a hero even though he lacked a quirk. Naturally, thinking of the boy's own safety, he had told him no, in no small amount of words, even going so far as to show him the grievous wound that had been inflicted upon himself not so long ago, which was now leading him down a speedy path to retirement. But that young man had aced the written exam, and tried so hard during the practical that it was damnably painful to watch as his quirkless fists battered, bruised and bled themselves all over the mechanical villains. True, he had managed to damage a few of the robots in order to gain a few combat points and had scored rescue points, several in fact. But when it was let known that the boy was quirkless, the majority of the teachers had vetoed his acceptance out of concern for his own safety. And so, Toshinori Yagi, the man known throughout the world as All Might, the greatest hero of all time, watched a quirkless version of himself crumble as his dreams of being a hero were utterly crushed. True, after seeing the boy's performance, he had argued for him to be accepted to Principal Nizu, seeing as the boy had managed to craft a near-deadly weapon in the support course portion of the test in less than half an hour, and it worked perfectly. Power Loader himself had stated that if he had been allowed to use it, it would have been powerful enough to put All Might on his back. But it was a lost cause. Even though he understood the man's argument, Nizu was adamant about the boy not being allowed into the hero course, no matter what Toshinori had promised, because when it came down to the very heart of the matter, Izuku Midoriya's body simply would not hold up against the rigorous training that UA put its students through. Tashinori frowned at that. He himself had gone through absolute hell to gain his own power, and he was still going through it. All things considered, he would have been perfect, he thought to himself. If I had just seen that from the very start, then I could have helped him. His quirk, known as One for All, was a very special quirk compared to others. Special in the regard that it could be passed along to another, a successor of a sorts, to inherit the power of the previous wielder and make it stronger for the next inheritor. And I spurned the perfect successor. The man sighed to himself as he stood outside of the police station. He probably wouldn't speak to me now, no matter how much I tried to make it up to him. As he entered the building, he was met by his longtime friend, a detective by the name of 𝗵𝗲𝗄𝐴 𝗧𝗵𝗲. The man was standing next to an angry-looking young man with ashen blonde hair. When he saw the shrunken hero, he smiled. Tashinori, he smiled. Glad you could make it so fast. Of course, Tashinori said with a skeletal smile as he shook his friend's hand. You sounded so urgent over the phone that I just had to rush right over, he said, and turned his attention to the young man, and you seem to be in quite fine company. This young man was the top-scoring student on UA practical exam. The blonde gave the man a snarling look. And just how the hell do you know that? Rather than be put off by the boy's hostile attitude, Tashinori let out a chuckle. I'm a bit of a talent scout for the school's recommendations, he said bashfully. Along with yourself, the school seems to have quite the impressive crop this year. Tisk, the blonde snorted. It won't do them any good, 'cause I'm gonna be the best they've ever had since All Might. Tashinori just laughed at the boy's confidence. It wouldn't do well for him to take him down any just yet. Having seen the boy in action, he knew of his explosion quirk and knew that it was very versatile in battle. He would do well, but only if he lost his attitude. But why on earth are you here at the police station, my boy? He looked to his friend for an explanation. He's not gotten into trouble, has he? The detective shook his head. Not at all, he said while the boy just crossed his arms and looked away from them. I was just finishing up with questioning him on an incident that he was involved in, he said. You see, a friend of his? He's not my friend, exploded the blonde. 𝗵𝗲𝗄𝐴 was quick to correct himself. Acquaintance of his was involved in what seems to a long-term kidnapping and child abuse case, he said with amusement laced into his voice as his quirk gave a slight reaction to the boy's statement. Tashinori palmed his face and brought it down to his chin. Dear Lord, anything but that, he said mostly to himself, though the blonde and the detective heard him quite well enough. And where is this Freya acquaintance? The detective frowned. He was in a clinic in the Shizuoka district. Tashinori looked at him with confusion. According to Mr. Bakugo here, he suffered a gunshot when he encountered the aforementioned child. The blonde boy winced as the detective continued to explain. Fortunately, he ran into Mr. Bakugo and another youngster, who accompanied him to the clinic to make sure he got there intact, while Mr. Bakugo took charge of the child and brought her to us. He gave the skeletal man an exceedingly grave look, but it seems that boy is quirkless, and the wound that he received was very bad. He shook his head slowly. It was reported to the station about an hour ago that he was transferred to the local hospital because a severe fever developed soon after he was treated. He sighed. But with the sudden manner in which the fever developed, we're thinking that the wound turned septic, or that the bullet that he was shot with may have been laced with a type of poison. Tashinori's brow rose to beneath his hairline. Poison? He gaped at the man. 𝗵𝗲𝗄𝐴 nodded slowly as he recalled reading the reports. The doctors found a very large amount of black widow venom in the boy's system, the face becoming graver by the second, and that would have been bad enough. But the doctors have reported that they've also found trace amounts of devil's breath in his system, the detective said, making both of them look at him in horror. Yeah, now you see why we thought that he'd been poisoned. Like hell he was, the boy snarled as he thought back to running into the boy before looking at the detective. He was weak from blood loss when I ran into him, but he wasn't acting like he'd been poisoned. Tashinori hummed in thought. That's something to think about, he muttered thoughtfully. Devil's breath is an extremely fast-acting virus. He began rubbing his chin as he thought about the situation and shook his head. No, if the bullet was coated with the virus, then he wouldn't have made as far as the clinic, no matter how close it was. 𝗵𝗲𝗄𝐴 gave a sigh of defeat. Well, however it got into him, he's fortunate that his immune system seems to be fighting it off, he said. From what the doctors are saying, the boy, even though he's quirkless, is also pretty strong. Bakugo made a disgruntled noise next to him. The girl that was with him stated that he was only showing signs of a severe fever before she left to phone her parents and look for a nurse to check him over. But when she returned with the nurse, the boy had fallen out of bed, vomited all the floor, and was drenched in sweat, which is the reason he was rushed to the hospital. His mother was supposedly able to meet them there after being notified. The girl is still with him, as far as I've been told. What about the child you mentioned? Toshinori asked, feeling that they had gotten off of the main topic. The poor little thing wasn't hurt, were they? The detective's face twisted into a look of pure rage. The child, a 6-year-old little girl, was, well, she was unharmed. But that doesn't mean she isn't hurt. He ground out angrily. He reached up and pinched the bridge of his nose. That poor little girl. She's so introverted that she's terrified to let anyone but this young man near her. He made a small gesture toward 𝗵𝗃𝗀. Her arms and legs were wrapped in gauze, so I had Mr. 𝗵𝗃𝗀 unwrap them to make sure that there were no injuries. He ground out through tightly clenched teeth. Both of her arms and legs were covered in scars, and they appeared surgical in nature, which meant that she wasn't just harmed. She was surgically tortured by her captors. The boy's hands started smoking as his palms released the nitrous sweat that powered his quirk. That's not all there is. His voice was cold with fury. He's right, 𝗵𝗲𝐻 said with a distinct tremble in his voice. She's psychologically damaged to the point that she believes that everything that's happened to her and her savior is her fault, and that the bad people will find him and kill him right in front of her as a punishment. If not for the young man in their presence, Toshinori would have shed his skeletal form and bulked up to his normal state of all might and anger. My God, he shook his head. Do we have any leads on who these people might be? Unfortunately, both the boy and 𝗵𝗲𝐻 shook their heads. The little girl says her captors all wore masks that looked like bird faces. He gestured to his nose, tapping the side. I assume that what she's talking about is most likely a beak, so I can only assume that the masks that they were wearing may have been plague masks. Toshinori frowned and thought, I don't know of any active villain groups that don such masks, but I know someone who might know, he said with a deep sigh, though I am loath to call him. He and I did not part on amicable terms. He shook his head. Anyway, I think I would like to meet the young man that saved that little girl. Do you know his name by chance? It's Izuku Midoriya, the blonde boy said. He's been my neighbor and my classmate for as long as I can remember. The look on Toshinori's face was as if someone had just plunged a shard of ice right through his chest. Midoriya. He thought with guilt heavily on his heart. I should have known. 𝗬𝗏𝗻𝗲. 𝐒𝐭𝐚𝐲 Midoriya had arrived at the hospital as fast as she was able without the use of a car, and was certain that the fees she paid for the cab would set her back quite a great deal with how she managed her bills. But that did nothing to stop her from getting to her son as quickly as possible. But by the time she arrived, it was to find her son in the throes of agony. The doctors and nurses were all doing their best to keep him from injuring himself further by strapping him to the hospital bed and sedating him, but whatever was afflicting him was causing so much pain that the sedatives were useless. Outside of the room where he was being kept, she saw the young girl that she was told had accompanied him, along with a couple whom she assumed were her parents. She was talking with them animatedly the entire time, giving 𝗏𝗏𝗏 little else to do but watch the nurses working over her thrashing son. So she sat down outside the room in a seat across from the girl and her family so she wouldn't disturb them, and started praying with all her might that her son would recover, and soon. Dear God, I give my only son who has been so badly hurt into your care. I ask that you give comfort to him to ease the suffering he has endured at my hands and those of others. She prayed silently. Reach out your hand and save him from the pain that plagues him. Please let my son forgive me for the pain I have caused him over the years, so that I can be his mother again. Mrs. Midoriya? She looked up and saw the girl looking down at her with worry written across her features. Are you doing all right? 𝗏𝗏𝗏 nodded. I'm fine, thank you, dear, she said as the girl offered her a handkerchief. She took it and dabbed at her eyes, not even realizing that she had been crying. With her and her son, it was usually obvious as tears tended to flow from their eyes like water spouts. I was told that you helped my son when he was trying to get to the clinic. Thank you for that, too, she said as she smiled up at the girl. But she shook her head, the jacks on the ends of her earlobes tapping together. I really don't think I did anything special, she said with a hint of embarrassment. All I really did was keep him company. The worried mother smiled at her. And that is more special to me that you can imagine, she said to the girl as her parents stepped up behind her. My son has always had a low opinion of himself since he was pronounced quirkless, and he doesn't really have many friends for the same reason. So something as simple as keeping him company when he's hurt is more than enough to raise you up in my eyes. The girl's father grinned as he placed his hand on her shoulder. That's our little girl, he said. She comes off with a bad attitude, but she's got a heart of gold. The girl blushed deeply. Dad. She shoved her father away. Not cool. 𝐭𝐸𝐽 couldn't help but smile at their antics, wishing that her son and her husband could have had such a relationship. Just then one of the doctors exited the room, looking heavily disheveled as he adjusted his coat back onto his shoulders. He muttered, looking from 𝗵𝐽𝐽 to Mrs. 𝗔𝗂. Could I ask which one of you ladies is Mrs. 𝗵𝐽𝐽 Midoriya? He asked with uncertainty. That's me. 𝗵𝐽𝐽 rose and stepped forward. Thank you, the man sighed as he adjusted his tie. Regarding your son, well, as you've most likely seen and heard. He gestured to the room where the nurses were still struggling to keep the boy restrained. Whatever he's been infected with has been causing him an extreme amount of pain. He shook his head in utterly bafflement. And I'm afraid we've expended the amount of sedatives we can safely give him. 𝗂𝐽𝐽 looked into the room where Izuku was just barely holding himself together from screaming and thrashing about. Whatever you're giving him doesn't look it's doing much for him. The doctor nodded. The fever he's suffering from is burning through everything we've given him at an alarming rate, he sighed. All we've managed to do is keep his temperature just barely low enough to keep it from causing permanent damage. 𝗵𝐽𝐽 whimpered worriedly while the doctor continued, and while we've managed to stabilize him for the time being, whatever's happening to him, he shook his head. We have no choice but to let it run its course. 𝗂𝐽𝐽's mother stepped forward and placed her hands on 𝗵𝐽𝐽's shoulders. Don't you have any ideas about what's causing this? She asked on the worried mother's behalf. This is certainly more severe than the gunshot wound our daughter told us about. The doctor looked between the two women, 𝗵𝐽𝐽 giving him a shaky nod, and reached up to pinch his brow. I don't think that this is a side effect of being shot, he muttered. What little blood samples we've been able to safely take from him have shown that he's, well, I can't say that it would cause this sort of reaction either, but there was a frightening amount of spider venom in his blood. 𝗵𝐽𝐽's hands flew to her mouth as she gasped, specifically venom from a black widow. 𝗵𝐽𝐽 made a strangled sound in her throat at the mention of the deadly arachnid as 𝗂𝐽𝐽's mother supported her shoulders to keep her on her feet. Now, dear, there's anti-venom for such a thing, she said in an attempt to soothe her, 𝗵𝐽𝐽 giving the woman a grateful smile. The doctor gave them both an unsmiling look. I wish that I could tell you that it would help, the man said as 𝗵𝐽𝐽's head snapped up at him, but the venom wasn't the only thing that we found. He then gave the woman a sorrowful look. I'm sorry, Mrs. Midoriya, but we've discovered devil's breath in your son's system. 𝗵𝐽𝐽 froze. Being a nurse, she knew about devil's breath, and what it could do to those it infected. Oh dear God. Her knees gave out as she slumped to the floor, 𝗂𝐽𝐽 and her mother just barely catching her in time. Jesus Christ, Doc. 𝗂𝐽𝐽's father snapped. Try being a little more sensitive, will ya? The poor woman's already stressed out enough. He's going to be all right, isn't he? 𝗂𝐽𝐽's mother asked worriedly as she rubbed 𝗵𝐽𝐽's back comfortingly. The doctor sighed, seemingly baffled. In all honesty, amidst everything he's being put through, the boy should have expired long before now, he said while 𝗵𝐽𝐽 made a strangled sound, which gained him more glares from the 𝗔𝗂 family. When he was shot, the bullet all but destroyed his liver, and then there's the added effects of the venom, which we believe is what's causing his suffering now, and the virus in his system. He went on with 𝗵𝐽𝐽 growing paler with every word. However, from what we've seen, the fever is causing his body to sweat out the toxins while the damage done by the gunshot is rapidly healing. As he spoke, both 𝗂𝐽𝐽 and 𝗵𝐽𝐽 looked at him with shock. The boy's body is fighting back on all fronts well, it's almost as if he has a type of hyper-regeneration quirk. The woman looked incredibly stunned from the doctor's statement. But my baby doesn't even have a quirk, 𝗵𝐽𝐽 said after finally calming herself down enough to speak. And even if he did, it doesn't explain how, because no one in our family even has anything close to that type of quirk. She sobbed. I should know. I've treated his injuries from bullies for years. The doctor nodded. Your son may have been quirkless before now, Mrs. Midoriya, but from what we have observed in the last half hour at the least, he has exhibited signs of enhanced strength, rapid regeneration, and what seems to be a form of bioelectricity. He lifted his sleeve to show the group a small red mark on his left wrist in the shape of a hand. Whatever's happening to your son, at this very moment, It has activated his dormant quirk genes. Quirk genes? 𝐭𝐸𝐽 parroted. Everyone has these genes, the doctor explained. Whether or not they are born with active quirk genes or an inactive ones are a complete coin toss. However, depending on how strong the genes are in an offspring is determined by how strong they are from the parents. Since your quirk and his father's quirk are technically weak, his genes were inactive at birth, making him quirkless. So this virus is making his quirk activate? Kyoka asked. Not quite, he said. You see, if his quirk was telekinesis or fire breath like either of his parents, then I would say that the virus caused the quirk to activate as a defense mechanism, he explained. But this young man is displaying multiple abilities that neither one of his parents have, which means that there is another factor at work. My theory is that the spider venom in his system and the virus were introduced simultaneously, meaning the spider had been infected with the virus before biting him, causing his quirk genes to mutate into what we're seeing now. Are we missing something here? Kyoka's mother asked. You said that it was a black widow that bit him, correct? Indeed, and I'm well aware that the species is not indigenous to Japan, the man said, frowning, which begs the question, where did this arachnid come from? Kyoka was quick to answer, the clinic. She yelled, startling the others. That whacked-out doctor that treated his wound jabbed him with some kind of cocktail he said was antibiotics and steroids. But he started feeling sick almost right after he was injected. Why would he do something like poisoning the young man? The doctor asked. An experiment? 𝐭𝐸𝐽 wondered out loud, growing paler by the second. He used my son as a guinea pig. Before anyone could comment, one of the nurses was suddenly thrown through the door and slammed against the wall. The doctor hurriedly returned to the room to help restrain the boy before he did any more damage, while a second nurse helped her comrade up. 𝐭𝐸𝐽 was left devastated. He's the same man that told us that Izuku was quirkless, she blubbered. How could he use my baby like a lab rat? Kyoka's mother was already on the phone to the police to report what they had learned, while her father was blubbering right alongside 𝐭𝐸𝐽. A few moments later, however, the doctor was sent sailing through the door by a massive blast of electricity. Spider-Man. By the time the police arrived at the clinic that Izuku had received treatment for his wound, the place had already shut down, and the doctor was gone. Nothing remained of the man's files, nor was there any evidence of the serum that was used on Izuku to make him suffer as he had. Detective 𝗧𝗏𝗄𝐻𝐸 arrived on the scene himself, having a vested interest in the case seeing as the little girl, Eri, had kept asking for her savior. He would later visit the hospital with the little girl at his side, only to find that the boy that she wanted to see so badly was knocked completely unconscious by dangerous levels of sedatives, but there was little the staff could have done otherwise. Izuku's new powers seemed to have set his body to an automatic defense, causing him lashing out at anyone nearby that his body viewed as a threat. With Izuku in his present state, he was in no condition to tell friend from foe, so the doctors had little choice but to use extreme measures in larger doses. But the fact that he was a danger to those around him at that moment did nothing to deter little Eri from wanting to see him. And so she was met with not her savior, but his mother instead. The woman, delighted to have a distraction from her own son's pain, was so similar to him that Eri felt safe around her immediately, and she recognized the girl with her from when the boy had passed her off to the loud boy. And while she was being held up to the window so that she could look into Izuku's room, she asked something that was going to make things extremely difficult for Naomasa in the coming days. Is Daddy going to be okay? With that one innocent sentence, the man knew that separating the little girl from the boy was going to be virtually impossible, especially with how introverted she was thanks to the long-term abuse she had suffered. 𝐭𝐸𝐽, not knowing how else to react to the child's question, simply smiled at her and said, "Yes, dear, your daddy's going to be just fine." The little girl seemed happy with that, and fell asleep a few moments later in the woman's arms. In the end, the doctors could only make sure that the boy was relatively comfortable and let whatever was happening to him run its course until the very end. And 𝐭𝐸𝐽, with the detective seeing no other alternative on what to do with Eri, was asked to take the girl for the night, which she was happy to do, having grown attached to the little girl within the short time she had been with her. When they were escorted back to her home, however, she was greeted with two guests that she did not expect. One was a skeletal man with blonde hair and sunken eyes, and the other was a small white animal. Naomasa knew them and introduced them both as Toshinori Yagi, a talent scout for UA and the personal contact of All Might, and the UA principal himself, 𝐒𝐻𝐢𝐳. She invited them all in before she placed the sleeping area in Izuku's bed. The little girls snuggled up under Izuku's All Might-themed blanket while Toshinori was grinning at all the All Might-themed merchandise. Quite the fanboy, isn't he? 𝐭𝐝 giggled. Oh yes, Izuku's admired All Might since he was just a little boy. Unaware of the stabbing spike of guilt that she had sent into the man's chest while he picked up one of the handmade pieces of support gear on the boy's desk. I can imagine that things haven't been easy while raising such a boy in today's day and age, 𝐒𝐻𝐢 said sympathetically. A child that's born without a quirk must have brought on a great deal of strife. 𝐭𝐝 looked at him bitterly while 𝐒𝐻𝐢 had his back to her as the hyper-intelligent rodent admired the volumes of handwritten notes her son had taken over the years. Yes, and I'm sure you've heard about Katsuki Bakugo by now? 𝐒𝐻𝐢 nodded. I have, and his mother was quite adamant that should we accept him, that we put the boy through counseling to curb that horrendous attitude of his, he said in a soft tone. Now, normally I would have told them that such behavior was intolerable, but seeing as they brought it to my attention before he was enrolled in our school, I agreed to take him in as a student and put him through therapy. If he doesn't improve, then we will have no choice but to expel him. Ack! Toshinori yelped as the device he was admiring burst open and sprayed its contents all over him. What the heck is this stuff? He attempted to remove the sticky mess. Spiderwebs? 𝐭𝐝 giggled again at the sight of the man covered in the stuff. It's basted on spider silk, and it's just as strong as steel cables. She boasted proudly. He even made it from cheap and recycled materials so that it wouldn't hurt our budget. That is something I would like to talk to you both about. Ugh, blast it. This stuff is sticky. Toshinori grumbled before 𝐭𝐝 floated a spray bottle toward him, the label reading web dissolvent. Thank you, Mrs. Midoriya, he said before spraying himself down with a surprisingly pleasant-smelling chemical that melted the web-like substance away in just a few seconds. Ahem, he said as he freed himself. Now, as I was saying, during the practical exam, your son displayed a great deal of what I personally believe it means to be a hero, ma'am, and though he was unable to earn enough combat points to qualify for the hero course during the practical exam, he did rack himself up quite a few rescue points, which was more than enough to have earned himself a place in the hero course. 𝐭𝐝 blinked. He did? She stammered. Then why wasn't he? It is simply because he does not have a quirk that we can't safely enroll him, ma'am, 𝐒𝐻𝐢 stated, seemingly taking no notice of the woman's bitterness. While the boy did exceptionally well in the written exams, as well as the support and general studies courses, the fact that he has no quirk. The towering blonde stepped forward. There are plenty of students that have quirks that are ill-suited for UA's training courses. Toshinori reminded the mammalian principal. They may as well be quirkless themselves. His gaze hardened into a glare at him. However, you blatantly disregarded the fact that the school has rescue points for those very students, since their quirks aren't suited for combat, and tossed this boy aside purely out of geneticism. Both of you, please stop, 𝐭𝐝 said, worried that their raised voices could wake the sleeping child. Thank you for telling me that, Mr. Yagi. I had no idea that the faculty in UA could be so unfair. She cast a small frown at the principal. However, the doctors say that Izuku has now developed a quirk, so I would appreciate it if you took this chance to reconsider his acceptance, Principal 𝐒𝐻𝐢. Both of them looked at her in shock. A quirk? How? 𝐒𝐻𝐢 asked, and 𝐭𝐝 quickly explained what had been found out while she was at the hospital. Naomasa nodded. She's right, the boy's exhibiting multiple quirk-like abilities, and has been for the entire time, he said and sighed in bitterness. But when we went to apprehend him, this Dr. Tsubasa was already gone, as well as all of his notes, data, or anything we could use against him. Toshinori growled. First the little girl, and now this, he said with some anger laced in his voice. Needless to say, I will ensure that the boy will be placed in UA's hero course if he agrees to attend it all, he promised the woman before looking down at the rodent. I was being nice when I pleaded his case before 𝐒𝐻𝐢, but now I'm threatening. He glowered. If he still desires it, then this boy will attend UA, and will be placed in the hero course, or else I'll pull all of my funding from the school, and I'll make sure that All Might teaches elsewhere. The mammalian looked at him with unease. I assure you that there is no need to go that far, Toshinori, he said hurriedly. I'll gladly place the boy in our best class so that he will be made into a fine hero. Toshinori smiled and turned to the boy's mother. Whether he attends UA or decides to go elsewhere, I'd like to make it up to the boy, he said with a gesture toward the boy's room. Does young Midoriya have a costume design he wanted to use? 𝐒𝐭 bit her lip as she looked to the shelf where her son kept all of his notes and blueprints. Unerringly, she reached out and pulled a thick binder from the row and began flipping through it. "I hope that you won't read too much into this, Mr. Yagi," she said as she flipped through the pages. "His father is a vigilante, but Izuku used to be quite proud of him for that fact," she said, smiling fondly as she remembered watching him draw it out. "So he wanted something that resembled his father's suit." She handed him the binder, allowing him and 𝗵𝗲𝗧𝗏 to have a look at the design on the page. 𝗵𝗲𝗧𝗏 shared a look with the skeletal man, Toshinori smirking at him. "His father, you said?" 𝗏𝐭 nodded rather proudly. "Yes, I did." 𝗵𝗲𝗧𝗏 was pinching his brow. "The reason he doesn't come home isn't because he's ashamed of his quirkless son, is it?" "No, it's not. At least that is not what I believe," 𝗏𝗏 said before giving both men a look of fear. "I haven't spoken with him in so long, but I know that he's doing honest work now." The detective just sighed. "I'm not here to investigate a vigilante that's been silent for the last 10 years, he said, "but I would like to ask you a few questions at a later time, provided you don't mind talking about him in general." She smiled. "Not at all." She shook her head. Toshinori chuckled. "I'll have to make a few changes and tweaks here and there to make sure it's not too obvious, but I think I can have our company make him an excellent hero suit." Spider-Man. Izuku awoke to an urgent buzzing at the back of his head, and he blearily opened his eyes to see a familiar figure standing over him and taking blood from his arm. "Dr. Tsubasa?" The doctor nodded. "That is the name that I have often used, yes," the man said as he raised up and injected the blood sample into a specimen bottle. "As I've said before, I am quite impressed with you, young man, yes indeed," he said, looking down at him. "Not only did you survive having your liver being practically blown to pieces, but the serum I injected you with gave you the gift that you've always wanted. I would suggest that you thank the spider if she were still alive." "Gift?" he asked a little more clearly. Tsubasa smiled at him with evident pride. "Yes, my boy, a very special gift," he explained. "While I'm not sure how far it will extend, you now have all of the abilities that most spiders have. Though, I highly doubt that you can spin webs of your own." He chuckled before placing the sample in his pocket and retreating from the room as Izuku began to drift back into unconsciousness. "I truly can't wait to see what you're capable of, my little spider boy." Birth of a Hero 3. Awakening. Izuku didn't know how long he had been out for, but he knew that it had been quite some time since he last moved. His joints were stiff, and his body felt heavier, as if he were being pressed down into the mattress. There was no buzzing at the back of his head this time, so he knew that something else was causing him to wake up. It was a soft sound, a voice. Someone was singing. The sound was unlike anything he had ever heard in his life when he listened to music while working on his gadgets. No, this voice was husky, yet it was so heavenly that he thought that he was hearing the voice of an angel. Cracking his eyes open slowly, he looked over to his right where the voice was coming from and saw the very girl that had helped him to the clinic sitting next to his bed singing a soft tune to a sleepy little girl sitting in her lap. He shifted his head a little closer so he could hear her better, but the movement must have caught her attention as she stopped singing a moment later and looked down at him with wide eyes. "Holy crap, you're awake." Izuku chuckled nervously as the little girl blinked sleepily in her arms. "Why yeah, I guess I am, huh?" Eri came wide awake at the sound of his voice and locked eyes with him. "Daddy?" "Huh?" Izuku blinked before the tiny girl launched herself at him, hugging him as tightly as her bony arms would allow. Daddy." Kyoka smiled at the sight of the little girl looking so happy, even when she wasn't smiling. "Yup," she giggled as she moved from her seat to sit on the edge of the bed. "It's what she's been calling you ever since they brought her over to see you," she said as the boy raised up in bed so he could cradle the girl in his lap. Izuku laughed a little nervously. "That's going to take some getting used to," he said as the girl snuggled against him. He looked over at the girl. How long have you been here?" The girl sighed. "Today?" She shrugged. "Not long. An hour at most," she said with a small blush on her cheeks. "But you've been out cold for a solid week." "Week?" Izuku said in a high squeak. "I've been here for a week." Eri sniffled. "You wouldn't wake up," she said. "We came every day, but you wouldn't wake up." Momentarily forgetting what she had called him a minute ago, Izuku smiled down at the little girl and patted her hair. "I'm sorry I made you worry about me, sweetie," he said. "But I told you that I wouldn't die, didn't I?" Eri nodded her head shyly. "You see? I kept my promise." Kyoka smiled at the pair of them. You know you had a lot of us pretty darned worried about you, right? She said with her hands on her hips. That Bakugo guy comes by every other day, and your mom comes by every evening to see if you've woken up. She reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out her phone. Speaking of that, I should probably send her a text to let her know you're up. He watched as the girl used the long jack-like lobes to type and send the message. So, what did the doctors say was wrong with me? Izuku asked as he held onto Eri. And what about her? Have the police found out anything about her? Kyoka shook her head. No. As far as I've been told by your mom, all they've been able to find is that Eri technically doesn't exist. She counted off on her fingers. No birth certificate, no medical records, and no information on who her parents might be. She frowned. Your mom and I have been taking care of her for the last week, so she's been in pretty good hands. Izuku sighed. That's at least some good news. Yeah, but you're the one that's got everyone's attention, she went on. That Dr. Tsubasa guy gave you something that wasn't antibiotics or steroids. It was some kind of spider venom laced with devil's breath. Izuku looked at her in shock. But I should be dead then, shouldn't I? Kyoka shrugged. Well, I'm not complaining about you not being dead, she said with a small laugh. Besides that, from what I heard, you've got yourself a quirk now. Izuku blinked, remembering something like a dream about the doctor standing over him and telling him he had a spider's abilities. He sat up in bed and placed Eri down before he got to his feet, not the slightest bit dizzy or even lightheaded. Hey, don't push yourself. Kyoka trailed off as the teen suddenly jumped up onto the ceiling and stuck there like a spider crawling across the tiles. Okay. Izuku could do nothing but grin at her from his position on the ceiling. The possibilities of his new quirk were running through his head like a bullet train. I can't wait to analyze this, he thought, thinking of how much he could fill up in one of his notebooks. 𝗧𝗵𝗲. In the week that Izuku had been unconscious, the good doctor had had a great deal of time to analyze the blood sample he had taken from the boy. The master had been quite pleased with the results of his research as well. How is our newest subject doing? The master asked over the static of a monitor in the man's lab. The doctor chuckled as he turned his attention away from his project. He's doing quite well, if I do say so myself, master, he said. Introducing the mutated blood to the Nomu's base form has given me quite the impressive little soldier to set loose. He smiled and turned back to the creature standing in front of him. The creature itself was easily 7 feet tall, with dark shaggy gray hair all over its body. 6 long arms hung from the body, ending in large 3-fingered hands, tipped with large razor-sharp claws. The head was large and rectangular, with 6 red eyes looking in all directions. Below those wicked eyes were deadly mandibles with huge teeth behind them. It's quite possibly my best work yet, the doctor smiled. I think young Tomura will be pleased with this beast once we enact his plan to kill the symbol of peace. He chuckled. With all of those arms, he's quite possibly as strong as All Might. And with the rapid regeneration that the boy's quirk has, it's virtually unstoppable. The master chuckled. I see, he said. Tell me, what else do you have planned for that sample you took? I do have something else to show. The doctor sighed and absently twirled his mustache. Though I'm not certain I'll be able to use this one, he said as he walked over to a containment unit. You see, after I created this advanced mutation Nomu, I decided to do a little more in-depth research into our little spider's DNA. He said as he turned the monitor toward the container, and I managed to isolate the most dangerous part of it. He said as the black substance inside the container lunged at him. What you're seeing here is nothing short of pure, unbridled aggression. There's absolutely no controlling it. Even if it finds a host to bond with it, this life form would ultimately dominate the host and become its own super being. My, what a magnificent creation, the master said with glee. Whatever you do, Dr. Garaki, do not dispose of this entity. I may find a use for it yet. 𝗧𝗵𝗲. It was only a day later that Izuku was discharged from the hospital after having every test done to him to make sure that the devil's breath had left his system for good. The doctors even going as far as to give him a dose of the antiserum they kept on hand as a precaution. Even when he was given a clean bill of health, his mother fretted over him like a mother hen over he chick. Mom, seriously, I feel fine, Izuku said as his mother fussed over him once they were on their way home. The doctors said that I'm back in full health. Inko sighed as they rode the train back to their district. I know, sweetie, but you can't blame me for worrying like this after everything that's happened. she said as she smiled down at little Eri, who was standing on the seat so that she could look out the window of the train as the buildings passed by. You'd be surprised at what I've had to go through just this last week. 𝐭𝐽𝐲 told me that you'd been talking to some guy from UA's scouting agency, he said as the woman smiled at the mention of the girl. So what have they been bothering you about? 𝐭𝐽𝐲 looked at her son. Bothering me? She frowned as she reached over and placed Eri in her lap. Honestly, they've been quite helpful. There's this nice man, a Mr. Toshinori Yagi, who works as a scout for both the school and for the main Tokyo branch of Might Towers out of Minato. At the mention of the man, she saw Izuku's eyes widen slightly. You know him? Yeah, we've met once, he admitted as he knew the man's alter ego to be All Might himself. So, what did he do? 𝐒𝐽𝐽 giggled. He's done a fair amount, dear, she said happily. You see, after that first night, when you were admitted to the hospital, he and the UA principal came to visit me. She told him with a look of surprise coming to his face. Apparently, he was present during the practical exam, and he said that you showed a great deal of potential for the hero course, she said. He even said that you had earned enough secondary rescue points to be admitted into the school. What? Izuku gaped at her. I wasn't told anything about that. That's basically what I said. 𝐭𝐽𝐲 nodded in understanding. But the principal said, and Mr. Yagi was quite upset with him because of this, that it was a matter of safety on your part for not taking you into the hero course since, at the time, you didn't have a quirk. So I suppose he stopped your enrollment because of that. Izuku rolled his eyes. Of course he did. He rolled his eyes resentfully. The little rat said as much in his rejection letter. 𝐭𝐽𝐲 reached over and patted his arm. Yes, dear, I know. But as I said, Mr. Yagi was very upset that he did something like ignoring the fact that you should have been admitted for those secondary points you earned, she said with a smile growing on her face. He outright threatened to pull funding from the school and send All Might somewhere else to teach. Teach? The boy's eyes bugged out of his head. She giggled. That's right, apparently All Might is going to be a teacher at UA starting this year. Grandma, I'm hungry, Eri mumbled. 𝐭𝐽𝐲 smiled at her and started asking her what she wanted to eat while Izuku's mind was racing. If All Might's going to be a teacher at UA this year, the hero course is going to be insane. But why is he suddenly trying to help me? He wondered. Is it just because of my new quirk? Or is he feeling bad about the last time we met? Daddy's talking a lot, Eri pointed out. 𝐭𝐽𝐲 giggled while her son blushed. Yes, sweetie, she patted her grandchild on the head. He does that. As the little family laughed and chatted, across from them sat a figure in a red hoodie. He took his phone out and took a quick picture before sending a message with the photo attached. Found the kid. 𝗧𝗵𝗲. A short time later, Izuku was at his desk for the first time in a week. It was just the way he had left it before being shot, meaning that anyone that didn't know Izuku Midoriya would think it was covered in garbage. Okay, given how I think her quirk works, something with a sound amplifying system would be ideal, he said, looking at a small set of speakers that had once been a pair of earbuds. And since her quirk is her earlobes, maybe something like a choker would work? He frowned as he remembered that 𝐭𝐽𝐲 had worn a choker around her neck every time he had seen her. Eri sat on the bed while he worked, watching his hands quickly throwing together the piece of equipment while she munched on a Nikamon 𝐭𝐽𝐲 had bought for them on their way home. Daddy? What's that? Izuku, having grown used to being called Daddy by now, smiled and showed it to her. This is my version of a miniature electrolarynx. The little girl cocked her head cutely as the boy-turned-father laughed. Basically, if you can't speak, this little thing can give you your voice back. He told her, but this one is special. He placed the device back on his desk. I've made it so that when 𝐭𝐽𝐲 plugs her jacks into it, her voice, whether she screams, sings, or even just talks loud, it comes out as a sonic attack to knock bad guys out. Eri blinked. So it's a present? Izuku chuckled. Yeah, it's a present. He smiled fondly at the thought of the girl in question wearing one of his gadgets. She was so nice to us that I thought that I could do something nice for her. He finished with a small blush on his cheeks. The girl looked at her father figure in confusion. Do people do nice things for each other a lot? Eri asked. Izuku shook his head. No, not all the time, he said with some regret, but some do, like me. Eri nodded. Daddy's really nice. He certainly is, sweetie, 𝐭𝐽𝐲 said as she came into the room with a plate of tea and the steamed buns. And I'm quite sure that he's famished after being completely out for a week. She smiled as Izuku cleaned off a spot on his desk so she could set the plate down. Though I have to say, Izuku, I wouldn't mind seeing more of 𝐭𝐽𝐻 in the future, she said with a small laugh. She's so sweet, and she's been a joy to have around since I started taking care of Eri. He grabbed a rag and wiped some grease from his hands before reaching for one of the buns. Did she come around a lot? Izuku asked in slight surprise. His mother gave him a mischievous look. Quite a lot, as a matter of fact. She smiled as she sat on the edge of his bed next to Eri. Since I still have my job, that week you were unconscious was hard on me because Eri didn't trust many people. 𝐭𝐽𝐻 was kind enough to offer to babysit her while I was at work. That explains why they were at the hospital together yesterday, Izuku thought as he bit into his bun, offering another to Eri when she finished the one she had been eating. Miss 𝗔𝗫 is really nice, Daddy, Eri chimed in as she took the food. She sang to me every day and read me stories. She mumbled around her bun. 𝐒𝐭𝐻 giggled as she gave her son a look. Better be careful, sweetie, or she might start thinking 𝐭𝐽𝐻's her mommy. She whispered loudly. Izuku blushed and would have denied anything like that happening, except that Eri didn't look very pleased by the idea. I don't want Miss 𝗔𝗫 to be my mommy, she said, sounding sad. Mommies are mean. Mean? Both of the Midoriyas echoed while Eri nodded. My mommy gave me to the bad people, Eri said, shocking the pair of them. Izuku and his mother shared a look before the boy stood up and picked the little girl up. Eri, you know that your grandma is my mom, right? She tilted her head. She's never been mean to me. Not once. It's probably safe to say I've been kind of mean to her in the past. He gave his mother a sorrowful look. His mother looked at him tearfully. I said some stuff that made her sad. But she's never hurt me. Ever. He smiled at his mother before looking back down at the little girl. Has she been mean to you? No, Eri said in that tiny voice of hers. You see? Izuku smiled at her. Not all mommies are bad. Some are just different than most, and some of them might seem mean to some people. 𝗃𝐽𝐻 nodded. He's right, dearie, she said as she stood up and patted her back. I have a friend named Mitsuki who's nice, though she is a bit loud, and she and her son fight a lot. She shook her head. If you've ever heard them, then you'd think that they hated each other. But she loves him just as much as I love Izuku, and you now, Eri. And nothing is going to change that. Eri nodded, seeming to accept it before finishing off her meal, and started to nod off. Izuku laid her down on his bed and pulled the covers over her. He then looked at his mother as they left the room. Has she smiled at all since you've been looking after her? Izuku asked as she shook her head. No, not once since I've been around her, she said with a watery frown. Even 𝐭𝐽𝐻 noticed. She thought she saw her beginning to smile once when she was singing to her, but that's as far as it got. She hasn't smiled at all. Izuku shook his head. Who could take the smile from the face of such a sweet little girl like her? 𝗃𝐽𝐻 didn't answer because she didn't want to know such an answer. Thankfully, the doorbell rang right then, and she bustled away to answer it while Izuku just went back to working on the support item. She peeked through the peephole and smiled as she opened the door and greeted her guests. 𝐭𝐽𝐻, Mr. Yagi. What a nice surprise. 𝐭𝐽𝐻 was dressed in her school uniform, most likely because she had just gotten out, given the time of day, while holding a little teddy bear and a small box of chocolates. Yagi himself was dressed as he usually was, a blue pinstripe business suit and hat, but he was also holding a briefcase at his left side. He tipped his hat to her. Good afternoon, Mrs. Midoriya, he said politely. I apologize for dropping by unannounced, but we heard that young Midoriya was discharged today, so we both decided to drop in. He smiled. I do hope we haven't come at a bad time. 𝗃𝐽𝐻 shook her head. Of course not, she smiled at the pair of them. Izuku and I have just laid Eri down for her nap, but you two are always welcome, she said, ushering them inside. Would either of you like some tea? Sure, 𝐭𝐽𝐻 nodded with a smile on her face as she presented her with the bear and the candy. I hope you don't mind, but I brought these for Eri, she said, a wan smile coming to her face. I thought that this might finally get a smile out of her. 𝗃𝐽𝐻 nearly teared up at the girl's gesture. That's so thoughtful of you, dear, she smiled as she accepted the gift. Thank you, I'm sure she'll love it. Toshinori just chuckled. I haven't come empty-handed either, Mrs. Midoriya, he said, indicating the briefcase he held. The folks at the company just finished it this morning. He held up the case. I've made sure that the suit is bullet and stab-proof, as well as fire-resistant, he said as 𝗃𝐽𝐻's eyes widened as she realized that the case contained the hero costume Yagi had promised for her son. The only thing that we couldn't do was insulate it to prevent electrical damage on account of young Midoriya's bioelectrical powers. Then he frowned at the woman. And though I'm sorry to admit it, we did have to rearrange the color scheme to include less purple and more gray and black so that the connection wouldn't be too obvious. 𝐭𝐽𝐻 nodded in understanding. That's very kind of you, Mr. Yagi, she said as she led them into the living room. I'm sure that my baby will love it all the same. She then called out softly, because dear Kyoka and Mr. Yagi are here to see you. She heard her son stumble and swear quietly. He came stumbling out of his room a second later, one hand holding onto the gift he had been working on for Kyoka, the other holding onto a rag that was attempting to wipe any grease or oil stains off of the device in his hands. Toshinori chuckled as he saw the boy. Back at it as soon as you got home, eh? Izuku looked at the man, stumbling for something to say to the man, but ended up only giving him a shy nod. Then his eyes landed on Kyoka, and 𝐭𝐽𝐻 noticed that both of them held a small blush on their cheeks, more so on her son than Kyoka, which made her smile. Toshinori cleared his throat as he set the case on the table. Young Midoriya? He said as he took a seat. I know that your mother has probably informed you of the situation with UA, and that you have been accepted thanks to my meddling, I should say. He sighed as the boy nodded slowly as he took a seat across from the man. Though, given how you were treated by its faculty, I would fully understand if you decided to receive your training elsewhere. Izuku looked at him, seeing that he was not only talking about being rejected because of his former 𝗧𝗧 status. He was talking about personally rejecting him when he pleaded with All Might about becoming a 𝗧𝗧 hero. When I was a kid, I wanted to go to the same school as All Might did, and that was you, Izuku said, speaking for the first time since he had arrived. I still want to go there, but it's not just because of that anymore. He stated hastily, making the adults chuckle. I want to go there because it's one of the hardest schools to graduate from. I heard an entire class was expelled the first day last year. Oh my, 𝐭𝐽𝐻 gasped. Kyoka's face went pale upon hearing that. Seriously? She asked incredulously. Toshinori nodded. The curriculum is, indeed, quite rigorous, and the teachers can be as harsh as villains at times, he said, smiling at the boy. But I would dare say that you will have no trouble in graduating from such a school, because, as I've seen, you do not give up easily. Izuku shook his head. I get that from my mom. 𝐭𝐽𝐻 felt tears of pride and joy coming to her eyes again. He gets all of his best features from me. She sniffled as the tears started streaming down, though my overly productive tear ducts isn't one of them. Kyoka and Izuku laughed as she bawled her eyes out before Toshinori cleared his throat again. Young Midoriya, he said, gaining the boy's attention again. Does this mean that you are willing to be accepted into UA? He asked with slight tone of sorrow in his voice. Even after you were treated so poorly because of your former status? Izuku nodded with a determined smile on his face. I just have more to prove than others, he said. Then a look of concern came over his face. But are you sure it's all right for me to be getting special treatment like this? Won't that cause some sort of favoritism issue? Toshinori scoffed. Special my behind kid, he grunted. If it wasn't for the faculty's prejudiced meddling, you would have had more than enough rescue points to gain entrance to the school, he said with a bit of heat in his weak voice. And All Might wanted me to pass something along to you. Izuku looked at him, as did his mother and Kyoka. Toshinori sighed. He told me of his little encounter with you. The two women looked at him with a bit of shock. And both of us saw your performance in the practical exam. He frowned at the boy as his eyes drifted down to his scarred-up hands. I've never seen anyone try as hard as you did that day. He frowned as the boy's mother fretted. Recovery girl said that your knuckles were broken, and your hands were fractured in several places, yet you were still willing to risk your life to help those around you. And then this whole thing with little Eri, and your powers happened. He chuckled as he shook his head. When All Might heard about that, he said it was like someone had shattered his soul, scorning someone that was more deserving of being a hero than even himself. He raised his head and saw the boy looking at him with tears in his eyes. He told me that no amount of apologies or favors could ever make up for the hypocrisy he committed. However, he continued, All Might wanted to rectify something. He said, you can't be a hero without a quirk. He shook his head, looking the boy straight in the eyes. Young Midoriya, All Might told me that you, young man, are already a far greater hero than he ever was or ever could be. He smiled as the tears in the boy's eyes overflowed. Toshinori unlocked the briefcase and turned it around, and for that reason, he chose to honor yours and your mother's wish for your costume's design. He lifted the top open while the boy choked when he saw the contents. And it is my pleasure, young man, to welcome you to the Hero Academia. 𝗧𝗵𝗲. Eri had been sleeping soundly in Izuku's room, feeling safe and warm in the All Might-themed room, unlike the room the bad people had kept her in. The room was always bright, and no one came to put needles in her arms, or cut her, or take her to the bad man. So she was completely relaxed and off guard when she felt something being placed over her face, only recognizing the smell of ether when its sickly sweet scent was right in front of her nose. Her eyes snapped open just as someone clamped it over her face. "Don't struggle, kid. This'll all be over in a sec," a harsh male voice whispered to her. But she did struggle, kicking and flailing her arms as much as she could manage before the ether began to take effect. Then, taking one last breath, she let out a scream that had been heard 2 floors down. The man must have sensed what was going to happen next as he dropped the little girl to the bed and dashed toward the open window before hurling himself through, as the sound of a door being smashed down came from behind him. But just as he was about to drop from the window, something grabbed hold of his left leg just as he cleared the windowsill. He yelped and fell, slamming against the brick wall of the building before looking up at what had grabbed him. He only saw the furious green eyes of someone before he was hauled back up and dragged back inside. The sharp buzzing at the back of his head was the first warning as if it got that there was something wrong. Then came the terrified scream from his room where Eri was sleeping. Before he knew what he was doing, the boy was on his feet leaping toward the door, slamming his shoulder into it with the full force of his enhanced strength as he landed with a crouch, just in time to see Eri tumbling to the floor while someone attempted to flee out of his bedroom window. Izuku would never recall moving faster than he had at that moment as he leapt forward, catching Eri in his right hand, and lifted her safely onto the bed while shooting his left arm out just in time to grasp the ankle of the kidnapper. As his fingers closed around the man's ankle, he felt the bones snap under the pressure he exerted before hauling him back into the apartment where he was thrown into the waiting arms of an absolutely livid Toshinori Yagi. The tall blonde lifted the man up to his eye level where his bright blue eyes gleamed with malice. "How dare you try taking this child from this home?" He roared into the man's face as he whimpered fearfully. Even in his shrunken form, Izuku would easily admit that Toshinori Yagi was an intimidating man, and strong given how easily he began to pummel the kidnapper while the boy donned his web shooters. Toshinori held him against the wall while Izuku webbed him there like a fly caught in a spider's web. After the man was secured, Toshinori pulled out his phone to call Detective 𝗧𝗵𝗲, furious at the attempt on the child. He passed his cell phone off to Izuku's mother, allowing her to speak with the man while he borrowed the landline. "Nizu, we have a problem," he spoke into the phone. "Eri was nearly kidnapped right from under our noses. If it weren't for young Midoriya, she very well may have been." He paused for a moment to listen to the principal. "I'm well aware of the implications, but we can't leave this family at the mercy of these people. They need a safe house." He paused again before a look of irritation crossed his features. "I don't care how much red tape we have to go through." The skeletal blonde then thundered. "Favoritism? Are you out of your mind?" He shouted, Izuku catching the soft voice on the other end that must have been the principal. "I'll pay for whatever is required so the school won't be out of pocket, but we need them in a protective environment. The school grounds are the best that we can offer with so many heroes standing by on campus. Now get it done." Meanwhile, 𝐒𝐭𝐴 was having a similar problem. Yes, I understand, Detective. But you must understand that, aside from my son, no one in the house has any combat-oriented quirks. God forbid she should have to, but I'm not even sure what Eri can do if she was forced to defend herself," his mother said as she spoke into the phone. "That aside, I won't have my son branded as a vigilante." Then a look of anger flashed across her face. "How dare you bring him up?" �㝗𝐴 shouted angrily. Izuku winced as he sat down next to 𝗂𝐭𝐴, who was tending to Eri. "Must have mentioned Dad." 𝗂𝐭𝐴 looked at him. "Your dad's a vigilante?" she asked with Eri snuggled up in her lap, the little girl still knocked out from the ether, taking notice that her little horn had grown significantly during the attempt. The boy frowned a little. "Yeah, I used to think it was cool until a few years ago," he said. He turned to thieving. "Geez, I'm sorry to hear that," 𝗂𝐭𝐴 said in a hushed tone. How bad is he?" He took a deep breath to calm himself before speaking. "Ever heard of the Prowler?" Izuku asked. 𝗂𝐭𝐴's eyes went as wide as saucers. "Holy crap, your dad is the Prowler," she hissed while the boy hung his head. "Hey, "That's nothing to be ashamed of," she said comfortingly. "A lot of people think he's awesome." Izuku shrugged. "I used to think so too, but it's been so long since I've seen him that I wouldn't even know what he looked like now." He sighed, his head resting in his hands. "He doesn't even call anymore." He then gestured to himself. "But can guess why? It's pretty embarrassing to have a quirkless kid these days." The girl looked at him. "Hey, come on, there's no proof of that," she told him while holding Aries' head against her chest. "Besides, if that were the case, then he could have been like a lot of other people and put you up for adoption instead of just leaving you alone with your mom." She frowned. "And even then he could have tried to have another kid." Izuku had to agree with her on that. "Oh, that's right." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the device he'd been working on earlier. I made this for you." When Izuku produced the little black choker from his pocket, Kyoka's cheeks began to redden a little bit. Not many boys tended to give her gifts, and what Izuku was holding looked like something expensive. She smiled as she accepted the choker. "You didn't have to get me anything, you know?" she said with a small laugh, appreciating the gift. He gave a small frown. "But I didn't spend anything," Izuku said. "I actually built this." "You built?" Surprise was clearly written across her face. "But this looks like a really expensive piece of jewelry." Izuku chuckled bashfully as she took the choker, noticing the little plug ports for her quirk. "Is this support gear?" The boy gave a shy nod. "Yeah, since I guess that your quirk uses sound as a weapon, I thought maybe you could use something like this," he began to explain. "When you plug your jacks into it, it amplifies your voice to supersonic levels." Kyoka shifted slightly so she wouldn't wake Eri up and took the choker she was wearing off so she could replace it with the support item. "This is so cool," she beamed at him. "I've submitted some ideas to have speakers in my boots so that I can use my own heartbeat for the sound, but I never thought to use my voice." Izuku couldn't help but smile at that. "You've got such a pretty voice, though," he before realizing what he had said while the comment had the girl turning beet red. I mean that, Eri likes to hear you sing." He blurted out in a rush. "Oh, she does she?" Kyoka was still blushing up to her ears as she started absently twirling her left ear jack around her pointer finger. "Well, I like singing for her too." Toshinori suddenly hung up the phone with a huff. "Aggravating rodent," he said as Inko handed him back his cell phone. "How'd it go on your end?" "Tsukachi is coming over with a few others to pick up the kidnapper," she sighed. "He's also prepared to post guards around our apartment building to make sure there are no more attempts on Eri. But I don't know if that's good enough." The skeletal man nodded. "I agree," he said, leering at the man still stuck on the wall who was giving the family a dirty look, his mouth thankfully webbed shut, or else he most assuredly would have been swearing like a sailor. If this thug was bold enough to come after her like this, then there's no doubt that this will happen again, perhaps within a few hours. He sighed and looked at the woman. "I know you don't want to risk him, but what about your husband?" Inko's face visibly darkened. "What about him?" she asked defensively. The blonde man held up his hands. Now, I'm not trying to imply anything," he said in his defense. "I'm merely suggesting that you could contact him and inform him of the situation." Inko frowned and sighed deeply. True. He would help if he knew that he was needed. He saw her eyes begin to drift toward her son, but seeing him could. She trailed off worriedly. His eyes softened knowingly. "You know I've met the man before?" Toshinori said, shocking her. "I asked him why he was a vigilante," he frowned. His answer was similar to what Izuku went through with Yue. He explained while the woman smiled. His quirk was deemed too weak to be a hero, even though he displayed great potential. The woman shook her head. "I already know all of that," she said. Gesturing to the couch where the children were talking, "It's him and Izuku I'm worried about." She let out a quiet sigh. "Hisashi's absence left its mark on our son." Toshinori smiled. "Do you believe he feels ashamed of the boy?" Inko slowly shook her head. "I certainly don't. Though I know my husband does have other reasons for staying away from us," she told the man. "But Izuku believes that his father turning to thievery was because of him being quirkless at the time," she said sadly. "But I know Hisashi still loves us." Toshinori thought for a moment. "If you decide to contact him," he smiled, "let him know that the charges against him were dropped." Inko's eyes widened. "And tell him that if he decides to come back, I'll pull some strings with Yue and have him hired as a groundskeeper to guard the school." "You can do that?" Inko asked. Toshinori nodded. "Technically, he's working as a mercenary, and as I said, the charges against him have been dropped. He just doesn't know it yet," he said. Nowadays, I hear he does under-the-table hero work and some bounty hunting for the pro-hero companies. 𝐭𝐽𝐻 nodded. That's true, but… She trailed off with another look toward her son. He had already been through so much that she didn't know what was right anymore for him. But she had also never asked why Hisashi had stopped calling her. Toshinori reached out and patted her on the shoulder. Think it over as much as you like, Mrs. Midoriya, he said, then turned to the children. Young Midoriya, now might be a good time to try your new costume on, he told the boy. You may need the protection it offers before the night's over. 𝗵𝘃𝗲. The police arrived less than 20 minutes later with Tsukachi leading the charge. The would-be kidnapper was taken down from the wall and carted off to the precinct to be interrogated, and the Midoriya family was made ready to be taken from their home and into protective custody. As the little family and Kyoko were ushered into Toshinori's car with the police escorting them, a figure peeked out from the corner of the building. Damn it. The man frowned and pulled out a phone. Mr. Rappa? Bad news, my guy failed, he said. The kid and the family taking care of her heading for the UA school from what I've heard, and they've got a full police escort. He said. He. Sounds like I get to have some fun, Rappa said from the other end. The kid's still the priority, right? The man nodded. Yep, boss says roughing her up a little's fine, but don't kill her, alright? He reminded him. No worries, Rappa said with an excited tone. You'll take care of your guy, right? We'll take care of everything on our end. The kidnapper's partner sighed as he hung up. Too bad. I kind of feel sorry for these poor folks. 𝗵𝘃𝗲. Kyoko placed her phone in her blazer's pocket as she finished speaking with her parents. My mom and dad are gonna meet us at the school, she informed the Midoriya family, 𝐭𝐽𝐻 looking at the girl worriedly, while Izuku was on high alert. True to his word, Toshinori had made Izuku's costume from high-grade material that was completely bullet and stab-proof, while also looking like whoever wore it meant business. The clothes really do make the hero, she thought as she felt her cheeks heating up a little since the serious look on the boy's face was giving her slight chills, even with the dire situation. She also tried not to think about how the suit seemed to mold itself around him, making his muscles more pronounced. The worried mother sighed. I'm going to have to apologize to them for putting you all through so much trouble, 𝐭𝐽𝐻 said as she clutched Eri in her lap. But I want my family safe as soon as possible. Kyoko just waved it off. No, don't worry, Mrs. M, she said, casting her gaze out the window. My dad would have done the same thing, she assured the woman, knowing her dad would have freaked out way worse than 𝐭𝐽𝐻 had when the whole thing went down. Young Midoriya, can you tell if there's anyone tailing us? Toshinori asked from the front. Izuku just shook his head. No, and that's what has me worried. He said his spider sense, as he was beginning to call it, had been faintly buzzing at the back of his head as soon as they had left the apartment, but not strong enough that he thought that they were in immediate danger. Just that they were being watched somehow. Toshinori nodded in agreement, feeling the same nagging sense that they were running headlong into a trap. Daddy? Eri looked over at the green/purple/black-clad hero in training. Are the bad people gonna get us? No. Four voices told her all at once. Izuku sat down in his seat and took the little girl from his mother, holding her close to his chest. No one is going to take you from us, Eri, I promise you that, he said, careful of the sharp claws on his glove's fingertips. And even if they did, you know I would come get you right away, don't you? Please don't, the little girl said, looking up at him with fearful eyes. If it's really them, then they'll. Izuku reached up and tapped her on the tip of her horn. Eri, you're my daughter, which means you're a part of my family now, he told the little girl, and nothing in this world would keep me away from you if you were ever in trouble. Understand? Eri nodded her head before she reached around and hugged him as tightly as her little arms could manage. He returned the hug gently. That's my girl, he said and reached for his belt, removing a small disc-like device the size of an American dime. And just to make sure that I can always find you, no matter where you are, I'll give you this, he said as he placed it in her little hands. Hold it tight, don't let anyone take it from you, and I'll always be able to find you no matter what. Eri nodded and placed the tracer in her hair like a barrette. No one would take notice of a child's hair accessory. She then sat between Izuku and 𝐭𝐽𝐻, clutching the little teddy bear that Kyoko had brought for her. The chocolates were in 𝐭𝐽𝐻's purse for later, but Kyoko had already given her a few and was delighted when she saw how the girl's eyes lit up when she tasted the sweet treats. Everyone loves chocolate, Kyoko had thought when she saw the pleased look on the girl's face. Still no smile though. But seeing the little girl now, nestled in between her new family, Kyoka could almost see the barest hint of a smile forming on her face. This is probably the first time she's felt any sort of affection. She thought to herself, a feeling of envy bubbling up in her chest as she wished, fleetingly, that she could be part of the little girl's life. A brief image of herself sitting next to Eri as she was sandwiched between herself and Izuku suddenly flashed through her head. Whoa, hold the phone. She shook her head. I can't be attracted to him. I barely know the guy. And who am I to want to mother this kid? She looked back at the little family, or more specifically Izuku. But instead of seeing him comforting Eri or looking out the window to make sure nothing was coming, the boy was clutching at the back of his head and looking straight up. Her breath caught in her throat just as Izuku's eyes began to widen. Like a precognition, Izuku's spider sense seemed to freeze time for a moment, allowing him to see what was about to happen as a large figure dropped down on the car, which would have crushed Tashinori. Incoming from above in 10 seconds. Izuku yelled out as he threw himself over Eri and his mother. Without question, Tashinori slammed on the brakes while the girls and his mother screamed, and made a hard left, fishtailing the car around and into the side rails of the road, the left side of the car only tapping against them. The police escort hit the brakes as well, but that wasn't what Izuku was staring at. A moment later, Kyoka found out just what had made the boy so shaken up as a massive figure slammed into the asphalt and sent a tremor through the car. This man, whoever he was almost as big as All Might. The man also wore metal gauntlets on his arms, as well as what looked like a plague mask. The sound of Eri whimpering at the very sight of that mask told the two teens all that they needed to know. Is everyone all right? Tashinori asked just as the villain moved toward the car with explosive speed. He grasped the passenger door where Izuku was sitting, his large hands digging into the frame. The boy was donning his mask, pulling what looked like a round grenade with his thumb on a primer as the door crumpled. The door was then ripped away just as Izuku threw his weapon while the giant glared down at them. Give me that girl and no one gets away. The man roared as the grenade exploded into a mass of web-like substance all over him. Why, you little son of a bit. Language, Izuku quipped while shooting a glob of webbing right at his mouth, shutting him up and forcing him to drop the door. And if you think you're taking Eri, then you've got another thing coming, he shouted as he jumped out of the ruined car. Izuku, wait. Inko yelled as she pulled Eri away from the door. The villain was ripping himself free easily enough, but she knew that Izuku was not going to just sit around and do nothing. But before the boy could do anything, Tashinori jumped out and grasped his shoulder. What are you doing? Izuku snapped. Making sure that you don't ruin your chances at UA. The man said, I, Tashinori Yagi, personal assistant to All Might for Might Towers, give you, Izuku Midoriya, permission to engage this villain. Understanding dawned on his features as the man released him. Izuku crouched down, feeling an electrical surge into his legs. Just as the villain ripped the webs off of himself, Izuku launched himself at the man with explosive force, leaving green arcs of electricity in his wake. The car bounced off of the ground for a brief moment from the shockwave produced by the boy as he jumped, surprising even Tashinori. All right, everyone out. The man ordered. He can't focus on the fight if he's worried about protecting us in this busted heap. He barked out as he signaled for aid from the police that were scrambling out of their cars, weapons drawn. Kyoka was the first one to bail out, just in time to see Izuku land a devastating punch on the villain. There were no sparks of electricity this time, but the blow was no less effective as the man was thrown back, forced to dig his feet into the asphalt to keep himself standing. Kyoka! Inko called out behind her as the woman was struggling to get out of the car with Eri still clutched in her arms. The girl was quick to help her, taking Eri in her left arm whilst helping Inko out with the right. Tashinori waved down one of the officers. That's Kendo Rappa. He's classed as a B-rank villain. He then called out to Izuku, young Midoriya, watch out for his quirk. It's focused on his shoulders. The boy gave no indication that he heard the man, keeping his eyes on the man as he started rotating his shoulders while the police were beginning to surround the dueling pair. Tsukachi, tell your men to hold their fire. He called out to the detective before turning his attention back to the fight. Don't panic. He yelled out his instructions. All of his power is in forward strength, but he can't keep it up for long. Keep your distance and tire him out. Izuku, instead of panicking, was very calm as the villain began to chuckle and advance toward him. Kendo Rappa, a B-rank villain known for his brutality and bloodlust from underground fighting rings, he rattled off in his head. His quirk is registered as Strong Arm, which allows him to rotate his shoulders at extreme speeds, allowing him to pummel his opponents with near endless punches. But it's said that he can't keep it going for more than a few seconds, so. The villain grinned at the boy. Hee kid, I'll admit that you got a lot of spunk. Rappa said as he lumbered forward, wiping his lips of a small amount of blood. But you ain't got nothing on my boss. Izuku kept his low stance. Give me a little time, and I'll lay him out right next to you after I'm done. The boy said, you might be bigger than me, but I promise that I won't go down easy. Rappa just grinned and put up his fists. Now that's what I like to hear. He roared and lunged at the boy, fist cocked back for a powerful blow. Better give me a good fight after that line, kid. My name, Izuku said, is Spider-Man. He shot a double line of webs at the ruined car door and swung it around and overhead to smash it down on Rappa, who laughed and unleashed a barrage of punches against it. The moment he did, Izuku shot another set of webs at his exposed middle, pulling back and slinging himself forward into a flying kick. His spider sense warned him before Rappa could bring a fist down on him, allowing him to just barely roll out of danger before the kick grazed the villain's exposed left side. Rappa laughed madly as he felt his ribs crack. Not bad, Spider, I actually felt that. He reached down and grabbed the offending leg and whipped the boy around, smashing him into the asphalt. But not good enough. The boy groaned as the pavement scraped against the metal plates on his suit. Then how about this? Spider-Man asked as he placed something on his chest. Rappa looked down at the device as it began blinking just before it let loose a powerful bolt of electricity into the villain's chest. Arg! Rappa screamed as the electricity arced over him. You little brat. He reared his fist back as the attack ceased, but Izuku was already jumping clear and throwing another one of his web bombs at the villain. He swatted it aside before it could explode. That one won't work on me again, kid. He snarled as the bomb splattered all over the pavement. You know, I was just gonna grab the kid and go, but you're making this fun. Let's see how much you can take. His spider sense went crazy as Rappa's explosive speed carried him after him with his fists flying. One hit from those and I'm history. He thought frantically as he narrowly dodged a blow that crumpled the street. The one thing I can rely on is that he can't use it indefinitely. He backflipped away and webbed himself into the air. I just need to stay out of range until he stops. All I need is one shot. Using the web shooter to swing himself around had been a fleeting idea. Now he wished he had followed up on it as he awkwardly swung into the side of a building. Rappa was already leaping into the air after him. Is that all you've got? He swatted the boy off the side of the building and sent him crashing down onto the streets below, a fancy way to turn tail and run. The villain landed and stalked toward the boy as he staggered to his feet. Guess I was wrong about you, lil' spider. Izuku shook his head. Nah, just wanted to give the police a fair chance, he said before he leapt out of the way. Rappa looked after the boy in confusion as he webbed himself up onto the side of a building. Huh? Apparently he'd forgotten all about. The police gathered around him. Tsukachi yelled, You heard him, men. Open fire. Shots rang out on the streets and bullets pelted the large villain, but they only made him laugh. You think that's enough to stop me? He raced over to the edge of the street and grasped a light post, wrenching it out of the ground and hurling it at the police officers, forcing them to dive for cover. My quirk might be in my shoulders, but my muscles are harder than tempered steel. Kyoko was beginning to worry as Izuku jumped from the building he was latched onto to re-engage. Tashinori, she turned to the man. Let me fight. Tashinori looked at her. Come again? He asked, shocked at her request. The girl was reaching into her blazer and pulling out Izuku's gift to her. You heard me, she shouted as she snapped the choker on and plugged her jacks into the device, the skin of her neck trembling slightly for a moment before the device settled. Tashinori sucked in a breath through his teeth as Rappa landed a hard punch on the boy and crushed him into the concrete. All right. Go. Kyoko turned on her heel and rushed into the fight. Izuku was hanging limply from Rappa's grasp as the villain held his left arm in an iron grip. Not so tough now, are ya, Spider Brat? The giant man taunted him. She heard him choking. causing her to suck in a breath, and then she let out the longest, loudest belch she could manage. The sound that came from her mouth wasn't what she was expecting as the high-pitched 𝗀 reverberated in front of her, shattering windows, ripping up concrete and asphalt, and sending 𝗵𝗲 to his knees and into an agonized frenzy as he dropped the boy so he could cover his ears. Izuku was barely keeping himself in check from the sonic attack himself, but he had to do something about 𝗵𝗲 before 𝗂𝐭𝐽 was forced to stop. The energy I had felt in my legs. He began forcing it up through his body and into his arms, specifically his right fist. It was now sparking wildly with green electricity. He leapt at the villain and drove the supercharged fist right into his face, releasing a shockwave of electrical energy as 𝗵𝗲 was propelled away from him, crashing into and through a building across the street. 𝗂𝐭𝐽 stopped her scream and rushed to his side as the boy hit his knees. Izuku. She slid to a halt and dropped to her knees. "I'm so sorry." She half sobbed as she cradled his head in her lap. "I couldn't think of a better way to get a shot at him." She yammered out as the teen reached up slowly and pulled off his mask. 𝗂𝐭𝐽 whimpered as she saw a small amount of blood dripping from his mouth, nose and ears. "Oh my god." Izuku reached out to her and grasped her by the wrist. I can't hear you right now," he panted tiredly as he raised his eyes to look at her. "But thanks, 𝗂𝐭𝐽. You saved my life." The smile he gave her was filled with admiration. Giving out a cry of relief, 𝗂𝐭𝐽 latched onto him, her arms holding him tight against her in a firm hug as the police and his family gathered around them. Tsukachi was barking out orders to restrain the villain while she faintly heard Toshinori talking to someone loudly about setting up the nurse's office. Spider-Man. Several hours later, Might Towers, Minato, Tokyo. Paperwork was the bane of any pro-hero, even those at the Might Towers agency, and Toshinori was now up to his neck in his own personal hell. The main branch of the police offices in the Shizuoka area wanted a full incident report in triplicate. The UA faculty was going to have a field day with him on account of allowing 2 unlicensed teenagers to make use of their quirks, as well as dangerous articles of support gear. They were viewing the remote mine Izuku used as dangerous, and he now had to fill out an employment contract for a known vigilante/mercenary. That being said, the man sighed as he sat back with a satisfied smile on his gaunt face. It's all going to be worth it. After the battle, 𝗵𝗲 had been taken away as fast as Tsukachi could arrange a transport to Tartarus, while Izuku and 𝗂𝐭𝐽 were congratulated by the police for a job well done. And while he hadn't revealed himself as All Might, Toshinori Yagi, as a member of a well-known hero agency, felt he had made the right choice when he had authorized the 2 teenagers to act as professionals given the absence of any available pros. After arriving at the school and having both children ushered to the nurse's office to have Recovery Girl treat them, Izuku's hearing recovered nicely under the nurse's care. Once he could hear her, 𝗂𝐭𝐽 couldn't express enough how impressed she was with the sonic choker he had crafted. As such, the girl hadn't stopped thanking Izuku for his gift until they eventually reached you. All the while Izuku was blushing madly with both Eri and his mother hugging the stuffing out of the poor kid. Toshinori would have thought the whole thing hilarious if he hadn't been so disgusted with himself for not joining in on the fight instead of leaving it all to the children. Inko had been beside herself the entire time until Izuku had knocked the villain out, and Eri was terrified that her daddy would die at 𝗵𝗲's hands. But he had once again proved everyone wrong. And he used a skill that no one really knew he had. Toshinori chuckled to himself as he signed another form to be sent out. Come to think of it, we don't really know just how strong young Midoriya actually is yet. He chuckled again. This is going to be an excellent year. Maybe I won't see the rise of a new symbol of peace, but 2 of them? The school for the greatest heroes, 1, the Prowler. 𝗵𝗲's attack on the Midoriya family's police escort had caused quite the stir in the media world as someone, neither Detective Tsukachi or Toshinori knew who or how it was done, had managed to get footage of the villain facing a supposedly new hero. Headlines in the morning's paper read, "Shocking debut. Arachnid hero stops B-rank villain." Last night, in the middle of an unnamed family's police escort, the wanted criminal Kendo the rapper 𝗵𝗲 attacked, and with the intent of kidnapping. However, it would seem that a new hero was also present during the escort. Though the battle was brutal, the hero, self-proclaimed as Spider-Man, was able to ultimately defeat the murderous villain, allowing the police to take the dangerous villain into custody. Much to Izuku's annoyance, the article mentioned nothing of 𝗂𝐭𝐽's involvement in the attack. "She saves my life," and all the media can talk about is how I took this guy down," he thought as he picked up another paper, noticing that one article did use her little assault on the villain. The media was having a blast of success with Izuku and Kyoka's debuts. Teenage heartthrob assists new pro. Late last night, during a dangerous villain attack, a new hero was assisted by a young girl with a quirk that allowed her to make use of her voice in the form of a sonic attack. While the villain had the hero on the ropes, this brave, beautiful young woman showed incredible bravery, leaping into action and stunning the villain with a scream that caused much damage to the surrounding area and disoriented the villain long enough for the hero to bring him down for good. Izuku had to smile and even blush as that article had a full picture of Kyoka hugging him after the battle was done. Oh, she's not gonna like that. Fortunately for him, the camera did not show his face. Of course, those were just the good reviews they had gotten. The bad ones came from the Japanese branch of the Daily Bugle. One such headline pinned Izuku straight through the chest. This article showed a full-color shot of Izuku in his spider suit with a shot of the Prowler right next to it, which pointed out the similarities in his costume and his father's. A new hero takes after infamous vigilante. Though heroes come in all shapes, sizes, and colors these days, they are still licensed heroes. However, it would seem that our latest hero has chosen a very questionable mentor if his costume is any indication. Yes, we're talking about the infamous thief, the Prowler. This menace to the heroic society has been at large for the past 11 years with no sign of slowing down in his one-man act of vandalism, brutality, and all-around menacing society as a whole. Izuku put the paper down on his new desk with a sigh. I wonder if Dad's seen any of this? He asked himself as he looked around his spacious new bedroom. The safe house that Yue had put up for them was actually a 2-story townhouse. Picture a 2-story version of the dorms. That was more than big enough to host a family of 10. Apparently, Toshinori Yagi, aka All Might, carried a lot of weight behind him, even in his civilian form. They had also been supplied with various pieces of furniture, a fully equipped and stocked kitchen, courtesy of Lunch Rush, rooms aplenty for sleeping and storage. Needless to say, his mother had never felt more pampered. Of course, now that they were under the protection of Yue, her job had been terminated for her own safety, which meant that now she only had her husband's funds to rely on. The little family had taken rooms on the 2nd floor, making sure that Aries' room was right between them in case the little girl got scared and wanted to crawl into bed with one of them at some point. She had slept with Izuku the night before, still frightened after the encounter with Rappa. Kyoka and her family were invited to stay as well considering the late hour that they had arrived after the chaos the villain had caused. Kyotoku, Kyoka's father, when he had heard what had happened, was furious with the police, demanding to know why there hadn't been any pro-heroes around to aid in the escort. Izuku had wondered that himself, and as Toshinori had tiredly explained, given the abruptness of the situation, none of the local pros were available to assist. Kyotoku had not been the only one to think that the answer was a load of bull. Even Toshinori himself was finding it hard to believe that the police hadn't called in a few pros to help. Naomasa had repeated, and stressed that none were available. When Toshinori translated that into none of them thought the escort was important enough, both families were disgusted. Yue had plenty of pros working for them, yet none of them had been on scene to help. Izuku wanted to defend them by saying that there was too much distance between them and the school at the time, because he knew that the pros working at UA were some of the better ones out there. He sat back with a sigh, smiling as he realized that part of his dreams of being a hero was finally coming true. There were still a few months left before UA's first-year classes began, and he had been excused from school quite easily. The principal of his old school had easily given him a pass and allowed him to graduate, partly due to the fact that he was as big a geneticist as most other people that scorned those that were diagnosed as quirkless. And since the man didn't know that Izuku was no longer diagnosed as such, he let the boy go quite easily, Izuku suspecting that he viewed the boy as a stain on his records. However, once that was all done, Toshinori had put Alderaan Middle School under investigation, the suspicions being that the teaching staff were teaching the students beliefs of the Meta Liberation Army. The man was ruthless. Izuku could not deny it, and it brought a smile to his face. All Might was making a massive effort in order to make amends to the boy for his actions towards him, and they were paying off. Izuku turned from his desk and looked at his new hero costume. I can't believe he used the design I had in mind, he thought as he took in the purple, green and black suit. His father's suit had more purple on it and was less streamlined, but the boy couldn't find anything he disliked about it. Then he looked down at the gadgets he had basically made the garbage he had managed to scrounge up from Dagobah Beach and sighed. They were bulky, and while they worked, they looked awful next to his suit. I wonder if they'll let me into the support course room to fix them? With that in mind, he grabbed up his notebook with all of his designs and headed downstairs. His mother was down in the kitchen with Eri sitting at the table eating a plate of apple slices when he came down. He greeted his mother with a kiss on her cheek while he kissed Eri's forehead. Did Kyoka and her family already leave? He asked, not seeing their house guests. His mother shook her head. No, they just haven't gotten up yet. She smiled and set a plate of omurice down for him as the boy sat down and dug in. We're actually up quite early, dear, she said as she pointed at the clock on the wall, which read just past 6. And Mika said that little Kyoka is not a morning person, so I figured that, with all of the nonsense that happened last night, I'd let them sleep a little while. Izuku nodded, understanding completely. It wasn't every day that fledgling heroes got into a fight with a high-ranking villain. Did the police find anything out of Rappa? He asked as he ate, but his mother just shook her head. So he's not talking? 𝐭𝐽𝐻 sighed. Dear, I know that this isn't something you'll want to hear, she said, her son looking at her curiously. Rappa escaped while he was on his way to Tartarus this morning, only just a few hours ago. Izuku choked. What? 𝐭𝐽𝐻 nodded. It hasn't been publicized yet, but apparently he was broken out of confinement while en route to the facility. She said, looking at the boy more intently. Izuku, I know that you want to be a hero, but last night scared me out of more than a few years of my life. Seeing you fight with that monster was worse than watching you getting bullied by Bakugo. She shook her head with tears coming to her eyes. I don't know if I could take it if that monster came after us again. Izuku shook his head and smiled. Mom, I get it, he said as he reached for an empty glass and a pitcher of orange juice on the table. I got lucky last night. If it hadn't been for Kyoka, then I don't know if I'd be here right now, he said, looking over at little Eri as he filled his glass. But I have obligations now, Eri's safety and becoming a hero that can protect her. 𝐭𝐽𝐻 gave a sad smile. I know that, baby, but hearing about it on the news and actually seeing it are two different things, she said. And the way you fought, well, I think you did well, but your father would have called it sloppy. Izuku paused with the glass half raised to his lips, but nodded in understanding. I know. I need to be better, he said, downing the juice and finishing his meal. He then rose and took his plate to the sink to rinse it. I'm planning on heading over to the school to check out the support course room. Maybe they can help me upgrade some of my tech. Eri perked up. Can I come too? She asked, not wanting to be separated from the boy. Izuku smiled at her. You sure can, Eri, he said as she jumped down from her chair and ran right up to him, jumping into his arms. He looked over at his mother. Will you be all right, or should I go? She smiled at the two of them. Some fresh air and a walk without the threat of kidnapping would do her some good. Izuku nodded and lifted Eri up onto his shoulders while tucking his notebook under one arm before leaving her alone. Don't forget your costume, sweetie, 𝐭𝐽𝐻 called out. Once she heard the door close, 𝐭𝐽𝐻 sighed and pulled out her phone, smiling a little at how many missed calls she had from hubby. She decided to call back. The phone only rang once before it was picked up. 𝐭𝐽𝐻? Hello, dear, 𝐭𝐽𝐻 said in greeting. I take it you've seen this morning's papers? There was a heavy sigh on the other end. I did, and I have to ask, what the hell, 𝐭𝐽𝐻? He asked. Izuku has a quirk now? When did that happen? 𝐭𝐽𝐻 sighed. It's a bit of a story, she said before explaining to her husband the events that led up to the news headlines. She could actually hear the man pinching his brow. Dear God in heaven, he groaned. 𝐭𝐽𝐻, I'm so sorry you had to go through all of this alone. 𝐭𝐽𝐻 smiled at that. It's not like you're free to walk around these days, Hisashi, she said. Besides, he has your tenacity. What he must think of me, Hisashi Midoriya sighed over the phone. 𝐭𝐽𝐻, what do you think of me? 𝐭𝐽𝐻 gulped and bit her lip. There was a time when I thought that you were doing what you're doing to make him proud of you, she said with a deep sigh of her own, and then the theft happened, and I don't know what to think. The theft wasn't my doing, honey, her husband sighed. I was set up to take the fall for a client's mistake, but I won't blame you for not believing me. 𝐭𝐽𝐻 nodded, and there was a long period that I thought you were ashamed of Izuku being quirkless. The line was quiet for the longest time as she heard his breathing stop completely. And then, 𝗃 Midoriya, there has never been a moment in my life that I have ever been ashamed of our son, he said in the gentlest tone she had ever heard him use. I may not have been around, but I've kept tabs on him. I know how hard he tries, and how devoted he is to his studies. I even hacked into the security cameras during the practical exam at UA, and when I saw him trying so hard that his fists bled, I couldn't remember ever feeling more proud of him in my life since the day he was born. 𝗃 was in full blubber mode, just barely keeping herself under control as her tears flowed freely. Do you really mean that? I do, he said. The only reason I haven't been home is because of the theft charges against me. Vigilantism aside, that was a huge black mark on my career. He said, that's what I'm ashamed of, darling, that I got played so easily. 𝗃 smiled into the phone. Dear, the charges were dropped a long time ago. They were? Come home, 𝗃 pleaded. There's a man here willing to hire you on as a guard for UA's campus. You can do honest, low-danger work, and you can see your son. She said, please, Hisashi. We need you. I need you. There was another long pause as her husband seemed to think it over and let out a statusy sigh. You tell this guy, whoever he is, that I'll take the job, Hisashi said. I'll be there in a few hours. 𝗃 frowned. Oh, we're not at the apartment anymore, she told him. We had to leave after. I know, sweetheart, he said. Don't worry. I'll find you. The line went dead then, and 𝗃 felt her heart swelling up with happiness. Maybe things aren't as bad as I think. 𝗬𝗲𝗏. This house is really big, Eri commented from her vantage point on Izuku's shoulders as he walked along the halls of UA. Izuku chuckled. Trust me, Eri, there are places that are much bigger than this one as far as houses go, he said. But this isn't a house, it's a school. Eri blinked. School? Aha, it's where people come to learn things, he told her. Maybe when you're ready, we can send you to school, then you can make some friends. Eri was once again confused. Daddy, what's a friend? That threw him for a minute. A friend is... He tried to think for a moment as his mind wandered to images of Kyoka and Katsuki. When they were small, before he had gotten his quirk, Katsuki and Izuku had been inseparable. But after the Ashen Blonde's quirk had manifested, that had all changed. Kyoka, however, was different. She was someone Izuku thought could be a real friend to him. You know Kyoka? Eri nodded her head. She's a friend. Someone you can talk to, play with, and depend on. She's my friend? Eri asked. That's right. Izuku nodded. Eri was quiet for a minute, thinking most likely, but she had him worried before she blurted out. So she's not my mommy? Izuku outright froze in an attempt to keep himself upright since he had the little girl on his shoulders. And no, definitely not. Izuku twitched a little as the thought of Kyoka taking the role of Eri's mother crossed his mind. It wasn't an unpleasant thought. Ease down, Izuku. You barely even know the girl. He thought to himself as he started moving again. I mean, she did come to see me every day in the hospital with Eri, so she know. Nope. No. Do not go there. Besides, what kind of girl would take an interest in a quirkless? Right, I'm not quirkless anymore, but... Daddy, you're talking a lot again. Eri pointed out innocently. Dear God, just kill me now, please. This he managed to keep to himself. The rest of the walk to the support course room was a quiet one, Izuku trying to retain some dignity while Eri was just marveling at some of the classrooms they were passing. Some of them had doors so huge that Izuku thought that they must be meant for students with gigantification quirks. Suddenly, Izuku's spider sense went berserk. His eyesight had gone blurry for a moment as a vision of something happening a few feet down the hall. He saw the door slowly being thrown off of its hinges and slamming against the opposite wall. Izuku jumped back on instinct, Eri tumbling down over his head and into his arms as he jumped and stuck himself to the ceiling, just as the 2-foot-thick steel doors were abruptly blown out of their frame and into the opposing wall by a massive explosion that shook the entire hallway. A person staggered out of the room. Oh man, I didn't think the opposing forces would be that strong, said a girl's voice, hoarse from the smoke. And this is why I told you not to do anything until I had a look at the calibrations, said another voice that sounded more exasperated than upset, as if this was a regular thing. Seriously, 𝗧𝗵𝗲, if you're going to make a gravity boot, you need to think about how much force the propelling side is going to produce. Yeah, but maybe rocket boots would be better, said the girl 𝗧𝗵𝗲 again. The man came out of the smoke, revealing a man armored like a bulldozer. You haven't even started your real classes yet, and you've already been labeled a living disaster. There's absolutely no way I'm letting you anywhere near rocket fuel until 3rd year, and that's only if you last that long. 𝗧𝗪𝗪 said before turning his eyes up at the two clinging to the ceiling. You two weren't caught in that, were you? Izuku shook his head before jumping down, making sure Eri was all right. Upon landing, however, she looked up at him. Can we do that again? Eri asked with a straight face. The boy chuckled. Note to self, take Eri for a swinging ride after I get the hang of it. He thought to himself. We're fine, Izuku said, before smiling. It's nice to meet you, Mr. 𝗧𝗪𝗪, he said, trying not to nerd out in front of Eri. He thought that it was bad enough that he muttered in front of her without adding fuel to the fire. You must be that kid that old Toshinori was harping to Nizu about. The man grinned behind his mask. Gotta say, I'm impressed that he caved in so easily, he said as the smoke cleared away and revealed a girl with pink hair and goggles over crosshair-like pupils. I watched you during the practical. You're one tough kid. Izuku blushed. Daddy's really strong, Eri piped up. 𝗧𝗪𝗪 looked at the little girl and then back at Izuku. Ain't you a little young to be a dad? He asked. And what about her mom? I don't have a mommy, Eri said. The pink-haired girl's eyes went wide. Whoa, no. Don't look at me. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 waved her hands and shook her head rapidly. I make my own babies. Izuku chuckled. It's a recent thing, he said before reaching for his notes. But I was wondering if you could help me improve some of the tech I've been using? For a minute, 𝗧𝗵𝗲 appeared to teleport. Did you say improve? She yelled, reaching for the book. Let me see. Let me see. Eri shrunk into his shoulder. She acts like my old mommy, she said. She yells a lot. That got 𝗧𝗪𝗪's attention, and he managed to get the girl to back off a bit. I'll be the judge on whether or not you work on it, 𝗧𝗵𝗲, he told her before he took the boy's notes to have a look for himself. These are some detailed designs, he said with a subtle tone of impression in his voice. These web shooters are going to be a little tricky since I don't know what you'll be filling them with. You've written the formula down as well. Good. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 was now peeking over his shoulder with excitement. Same formula for the web bombs, except they have a larger payload and an explosive to trigger the release of the web fluid. I might replace that with a sort of electronic trigger, if you don't mind. Izuku shook his head. I don't, he said, presenting one of his original web shooters. When I started making these things, all I really had to work with was garbage from Dagobah Beach. Then I'm doubly impressed that you made such a fine support item from such low-grade materials, 𝗧𝗪𝗪 said before flipping the page. Spider tracer, remote mine, and a spider drone. These are some pretty impressive tech ideas for someone that's not even going for the support course. I'm actually jealous of the hero course right now. It's how I was going to fight before I got my quirk, but since I have most of the abilities of a spider, I thought my gadgets would be a good gimmick. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 chimed in, spider-like powers and spider-themed gadgets, she said. Creepy, but I like it. Izuku felt like someone had just stabbed him in the back. Creepy? His face fell while 𝗧𝗪𝗪 swatted the girl. Violent, 𝗧𝗵𝗲 complained. What did I do? Clearing his throat, the pro hero said, I've already got the specs on your costume, so I'll make the items to match, and I'll try to make the wrist-mounted web shooters a bit less bulky so you can use them better. Also, I'd like to try to make these web cartridges a bit stronger so they can hold more. Is that okay? Izuku handed him the case holding his costume. Please feel free to make any improvements you think will be necessary, Izuku told him, then sheepishly asked, Also, could I get your autograph? He pulled out one of his many notebooks. Ever the fanboy. Spider-Man. Are we seriously going to let this kid enroll here? Asked Shota Aizawa, the teacher for Class 1A, a class that had been expelled the previous year because none of the students had taken being heroes serious enough for the underground hero standards. Principal Nizu sighed as the two of them watched the security feed from the support course room. Both of them focused on the student in question. Yes, we are, and I want to hear nothing more on the subject as I've explained it to you several times already. Oh, our big, flashy dolt of a hero threatens to pull funding, and you cave in faster than the Cubs in a championship game. The man sighed. Do we really need his money that badly? Nizu shook his head. No, but this boy does show potential. I know you've seen it too, or else you wouldn't be this adamant about putting him in Class 1B. he said. "You're afraid that this year's crop will not meet your criteria, and you will be forced to expel them again," the little white mammal said. "Our courses to become heroes are among the most trying in all of Japan, if not the world. However, you are the reason we are hailed as the most difficult school to apply for since only a few hero classes are accepted. And this boy has impressed you. I'll admit that he has guts taking on mechanical D-rank villains the way he did, but having him in my class isn't what's bothering me," Aizawa said. "It's the way All Might's been acting. Just because you want him to teach here, he has you by the tail, and you're basically kowtowing to him on everything." The scruffy man growled, Nizu knowing of his dislike for flashy, glory-hunting heroes. "Did you know that he's even talking about bringing in a vigilante as an additional guard for the campus?" "Yes, I've spoken with him about that as well," Nizu said, sighing as he poured himself a cup of tea. "It's true, I don't care one bit for it, but this time I think I can agree with it. The little girl with the Midoriya family has suffered greatly due to her captors, and they have even attempted to recapture her, so taking them in for protection and hiring this man are the least of what I'm willing to put up with for their safety." Aizawa sighed, rubbing his eyes. "About the kid, what's the old lady say about her?" "She hasn't seen her yet," he said. "They've only just arrived after all, and the child is extremely timid from what I've been told, so it won't do to rush things when we won't see results." The man sighed. "I can't argue with you on that," he said and rose up from the couch he was sitting on. "All right, I'm going to go read through the list of students that are coming my way. Speaking of students, why do you always send the recommendations to my class?" "It's so that I can know for certain that they are worth the effort," Nizu said. "I heard that there was one student in the recommendations that actually turned it down after a small confrontation with the young man he gave up his spot to." He then smiled. "Also, for your information, I don't send all of them to you. There were 4 that accepted the invitation, and I've only given you 2 of them. The other 2 are in Vlad King's class 1B. The man gave him a look. "Yes, but you've given me one of the most troublesome ones." He frowned as he looked down at one of the names on the list. "Shoto Todoroki," Aizawa said. "Kid's got a rare dual-type quirk that mixes his father's and his mother's quirks perfectly." He shook his head. "He's obviously a product of a quirk marriage, and it's left its mark on him in more ways than one. There was one more, but that young man was the one that gave Mr. Todoroki his spot and opted out for Shiketsu High, and I think he'll do well there." Nizu sighed. "A shame, really. That was one student that I had taken an interest in myself." Spider-Man. Outside the gates of the school, a taxicab stopped, and out stepped a tall, well-built man with a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. His hair was a mess of green/black curls, and he had a light dusting of faded freckles across his nose. "Thanks," he said as he paid the driver. The driver thanked in turn and looked at the man. "You know, I think I've seen you somewhere before," the old man said. "Ain't you a pro?" The man just smiled and shook his head. "Nah, just a guy that does odd jobs here and there," said Hisashi Midoriya as he turned and walked toward the school.